There's a moment in the very first episode of the 11th season of South Park where Stan Marsh's father, Randy, is standing on the set of Wheel of Fortune, sweating under the studio lights, staring at a puzzle that everyone in the room has already solved in their heads. The category is People Who Annoy You. The letters spelt out on the board very obviously point to one answer, and Randy, in front of a national television audience, confidently picks the other one. He doesn't pick naggers. He picks the word the show would not let me say even if I wanted to, and the second it leaves his mouth, the world he knew is over. The audience freezes. The host freezes. The cameras keep rolling. And the rest of the episode is essentially the slow, agonizing consequence of one syllable. That single moment is the cleanest distillation of what South Park has been doing with race for almost 30 years. Not endorsing the word, not using it for shock, building an entire half hour of television around the idea that a single word can rearrange a man's whole life, and then asking, in its own crude, deliberately uncomfortable way, what that means about all of us. Tonight on Paper Town, we are going through the South Park episodes that have most directly waded into race. The ones people remember as their most racist. The ones that were actually about racism. The ones that got pulled. The ones that brought in the network's lawyers. The ones critics still write about. And the ones that quietly slipped past everyone the first time around. So get comfortable, turn the lights down, settle in. We will be here a while, and if you haven't subscribed yet, it really does help us keep making these. The Wheel of Fortune episode is officially titled With Apologies to Jesse Jackson, and it opens the 11th season of the show, originally airing in the spring of 2007. From the very first scene, Trey Parker and Matt Stone have no interest in being subtle. They put Randy in the most public possible setting, hand him the most public possible failure, and then they refuse to let him off the hook. Within hours of the broadcast inside the show, Randy is being branded the N-word guy. He cannot go to the grocery store. He cannot go to work. His son Stan tries to defend him, telling everyone at school that his dad isn't really racist, that he just made a mistake on a game show, and very quickly Stan finds out that the defense does not work the way he thought it would. The episode is built around two parallel storylines, and the parallel is the whole point. While Randy is trying to apologize his way back into society, his best path forward apparently leading him to the doorstep of the real Jesse Jackson, who appears in the episode voiced by an impersonator and ends the conversation by having Randy kiss him on the backside, Stan is having a much quieter and much more important conversation with his classmate, the black kid whose name at the time the show insisted on writing as Token. Stan keeps telling Token that he understands. He keeps saying that he knows how Token feels, that he gets it, that they are on the same team. And Token keeps very patiently telling Stan that, no, he doesn't get it, and that the gap between sympathy and understanding is not something Stan can talk his way across. That second storyline is the one that survives the test of time. Randy's half is loud, broad, deliberately ridiculous. Stan and Token's half is sad. By running the two side by side, the show suggests that the bigger lesson belongs to the quieter plot. Someone who has never been on the receiving end of a slur does not actually know what the slur does to a person, and pretending otherwise is its own kind of harm. That idea is never stated outright. It is made by the construction of the episode, by the contrast between Randy's flailing and Token's stillness. There is one more layer the show adds, and this is the one that tends to get left out when people summarize the episode online. The Randy plotline pulls in a character named Michael Richards. That is the real comedian who, only months before this episode aired, had a notorious onstage meltdown at a Los Angeles comedy club in which he used the same slur repeatedly against hecklers. The show drags him into the story as a kind of ghost. He shows up in support groups for people whose lives have been derailed by the word. He shows up alongside Mark Fuhrman, the real-life detective whose use of the slur became central to the O.J. Simpson trial. Whether or not you find the inclusion of those real people fair, the choice was a deliberate one. The episode wanted you to know it was talking about specific public events. It was not inventing a clean fictional sandbox to play in. It was reaching directly into the news cycle of that exact year and rearranging the pieces. What people sometimes forget is that the writers had been sitting on the idea for years before they ever wrote it. In commentaries and interviews, Trey Parker and Matt Stone have spoken about how the Wheel of Fortune set up, the visual gag of those letters on the board with only one letter missing, was a piece of writer's room comedy that they kept circling and never had the right vehicle for. The Richards incident gave them the vehicle. That timing is part of why the episode lands as hard as it does. It does not feel like a pre-planned sermon. It feels like a very fast, very angry, very confused reaction to something that had only just happened, and that mood, that confusion, is built into Randy's face for the whole 22 minutes. By most accounts, the production also asked black members of the show's team to record the slur for the version that aired, and they specifically chose not to bleep it the first time Randy says it. The reasoning, according to interviews the creators have given over the years, was that the entire premise of the episode is the weight of the word, and a bleep would have made the word weightless. You would have heard a noise, not a slur, and the entire town's reaction would have read as overreaction. So the show forces the audience to hear it once. After that, every time it appears, it is heavily processed, distorted, made into something almost unintelligible. The way the show implies the word should be treated by everyone who has not earned the right to say it. That choice is more careful than most viewers give the episode credit for. The first time the word lands, it is meant to feel terrible. Every time after that, it is meant to feel like a noise that should not exist in polite air at all. By the closing scenes, Randy is still not really forgiven. He is tolerated. He is allowed to walk through town again. The show refuses to pretend the world snaps back into shape. Stan and Token are friends again, but only after Stan finally admits, in plain language, that he does not understand and that he should stop saying he does. That admission, small and quiet, is what the episode is built to deliver. The whole half hour is a slow descent from a loud public mistake to a small private honest sentence. And whatever you think of the show, the engineering of that descent is impressive. It is one of those episodes where you can see, frame by frame, exactly what the writers were trying to do. Stay there for a moment, because the next episode I want to take you through sits about 7 years earlier in the show's history, in the middle of its 4th season. And it is the one a lot of people think of first when they think about South Park stepping straight into the deep end. The episode is called Chef Goes Nanners. It aired in the summer of 2000, and the entire plot is built around the town flag of South Park itself. The flag, as the show reveals in the cold open, depicts 4 white stick figures cheerfully hanging a 5th black stick figure from a tree. That is the image. It is on every official document. It is on the town hall wall. It is on the children's school books. It has apparently been there forever, and as the episode begins, Chef has decided enough is enough, and that the flag must be changed. What makes the episode interesting, and what makes it so frequently cited when people talk about the show's politics, is that it is not built around the obvious adults agreeing with Chef. It is built around the children. The 4th grade class is given the assignment of debating the flag in front of the town, and Stan, Kyle, Kenny, and Cartman are split across both sides. The unsettling beat the show keeps returning to is that the children, when they look at the flag, do not actually see what the adults see. They see 4 people of one color and 1 person of another color, but the racial meaning of that arrangement does not register with them at all. They see a graphic. Their parents see a history. The gap between those 2 ways of looking at the same image is the engine of the entire episode. The case the show is making here is one that has aged in complicated ways since the year 2000. The suggestion is that racism is something children have to be taught, that the meaning of the image is a learnt meaning rather than a native one, and that the children's blankness in the face of the flag is, in its own strange way, a kind of innocence. That reading was not new. It was a common talking point in American public discourse around race at the time the episode aired, and the show leans hard into it. Whether you find that reading honest or naive depends largely on what you brought into the episode with you, and the writers seem aware of that. They do not let the children's reading stand untouched. They keep cutting back to the adults, both black and white, who very clearly do see what the flag depicts, and who are not interested in being told they are imagining it. The compromise the episode arrives at, after a lot of running around and a subplot about Chef's parents arriving in town with a story about the Loch Ness Monster trying to scam them out of $350, is that the flag stays the same in form, with the figures still arranged in the same pattern, but it gets recolored so that the racial dimension is taken away. Chef is satisfied. The adults are satisfied. The show implies that the resolution is a bit of a cheat, that the underlying argument has not really been settled, and that the town has simply found a polite way to look past it. That note is part of the texture of the episode. What the show seems to want you to leave with is the sense that the flag was always about a specific historical event, and that no amount of recoloring really erases what the original image was, but that the town would rather pretend it does than have a fight about it. The episode is also famous for a parallel storyline that has nothing to do with race at all. Chef, on a separate plot thread, is given oysters. And oysters, the show tells us in its blunt and cheerful way, are an aphrodisiac. The result is that Chef spends the entire second half of the episode in a state of constant, screaming arousal, and the joke runs on top of the very serious flag plot like a layer of cake icing dropped on a tombstone. That combination is one of the things people remember most clearly about the episode. It is also one of the things that makes it hard to discuss the show's racial politics with a straight face. The writers refuse to let a serious thread be just serious. They cut to a man named Chef howling at the sky about how everything is making him excited, and then they cut back to a 4-foot-tall black child explaining the meaning of public symbolism. The whiplash is the style. It is intentional. It also makes the episode legendarily hard to defend in polite company. What is interesting in hindsight is how often this episode gets paired in online discussion with episodes from much later in the show's run. People who write about the show's politics tend to treat Chef Goes Nanners as the early flag in the ground. The first time the show very directly put racial imagery on the screen and asked the audience to look at it. Later episodes refine the approach. With Apologies to Jesse Jackson would refine it. The Wealthy Black Families episode would refine it. The slavery satire later in season 15 would refine it. But this is where the show planted the idea that it was going to keep returning to. The suggestion, when you look back across the whole run, is that the writers were trying to figure out what they actually thought, and that the figuring out happened in public, with every episode getting a little more careful than the one before it. Not every viewer agrees that they got more careful, but there is a clear progression if you watch the episodes in order. And Chef Goes Nanners is where the progression starts. The next stop on that progression is an episode that aired in late autumn of 2001 in the back half of South Park's 5th season, and it is called Here Comes the Neighborhood. The premise sounds at first like a sitcom one-liner. Token Black, the only black child in the elementary school, is feeling out of place because every other child in his class is white and he has no one to relate to. The way he frames it in the few quiet beats the show gives him is not about skin color at all. It is about money. Token's family is, by the standards of the town, conspicuously wealthy. His house is bigger than anyone else's. His parents drive luxury cars. He has been raised with a softness that the other boys, especially Cartman, will never let him forget. So Token does what a child would do if a child had the means to do it. He goes home and asks his parents to invite more wealthy families into the neighborhood so that he can finally have peers who understand him. The twist the episode runs on, and the joke that powers the entire half hour, is that every wealthy family that arrives in South Park in response to the invitation is also black. Will Smith and his children come to town. Kobe Bryant and Snoop Dogg and Oprah Winfrey are referenced. The show populates the neighborhood with celebrity caricatures who are all, by coincidence within the world of the show, but very obviously by design within the writer's room, members of the same race. Token has imported what he thinks of as a class community, and the town's white residents read it instantly as something else. They read it as the arrival of black people in their town, and they spend the rest of the episode in escalating panic about it. What the show is doing is one of its oldest tricks. It is taking a very specific anxiety, the white American panic about black neighbors moving in next door, the panic that real estate historians and sociologists wrote thousands of pages about during the 20th century, and it is dragging that anxiety into the foreground by giving the show's white characters the exact thoughts they would never say out loud. The townspeople form a kind of hooded organization to scare the new families away. They wear long white robes and pointed hoods. The reference is the obvious one, and the show refuses to soften it. Then, in a beat that is pure South Park, we learn that the townspeople have specifically chosen the robes to indicate that they hate rich people, not black people, and that they genuinely believe wealth is the problem. The point being made is that the white residents of South Park are aware enough of how their behavior looks that they have constructed an elaborate alternative justification for it, and that the alternative justification does not change what they are actually doing. That is one of the most pointed jokes the show ever wrote about racism. It is not a joke about a slur. It is not a joke about a flag. It is a joke about the way a community will reach for a more flattering reason to do something rather than admit the original reason. The unspoken half of the gag is that this kind of substitution is everywhere in adult American life, that it powers entire political movements, and that the people doing it sincerely believe they are not racist because they have done the work of inventing a parallel grievance. The episode does not lecture you about that idea, it just shows it. It gives you a town of robed adults standing on the sidewalk insisting that they only object to the new arrivals because they are wealthy. It is one of the few times the show writes a joke so sharp that it survives even the messy ending. The ending, of course, is messy. The wealthy families decide South Park is not where they want to be. They leave. The town returns to the way it was. Token is left exactly where he started, the only black child in his class, the only wealthy child in the neighborhood, with the suggestion that the version of community he was looking for might not actually exist anywhere within driving distance. The show treats Token's loneliness as structural rather than solvable, and the adults around him are too far gone in their own performances to give him what he asked for. The episode ends without the resolution most sitcoms would reach for. It leaves Token where it found him. That choice, more than the robed adults or the celebrity cameos, is what makes the episode stick with people. There is also, sitting underneath that plot, a piece of the show's larger ongoing experiment with Token as a character. South Park has often been criticized for the way it uses Token, and the criticism is not unfair. For most of the show's run, Token is the only black student in the school, and he is given fewer plot lines than almost any other recurring child. The writers have addressed this in interviews and on commentary tracks, sometimes more directly than other times. The decision to make Token the wealthy child was, in their telling, a kind of deliberate counter to the cliché of having him be poor. The decision to give him an episode about feeling racially isolated was the writers acknowledging, very early, that the show was aware of its own choices. Whether that acknowledgement counts as an answer or just a shrug is something the show would keep coming back to for the next 20 years, and we will get to that. 3 years after Here Comes the Neighborhood, in the 8th season of the show, South Park aired an episode that took the same trick of relocating a current anxiety into a stranger setting and pushed it as far as the writers had ever pushed it. The episode is called Goobacks, and it originally aired in the spring of 2004. The setup is presented with a perfectly straight face. A man in tattered clothing arrives at the local job center, speaking a language no one understands, and explains with the help of subtitles that he has come from the future. Specifically, he has come from a future so impoverished that the only escape his society has left is to travel backwards in time to find work. The town learns very quickly that the man is the first of many. Soon, thousands of future immigrants are arriving every day. They are willing to work for less than the locals. They send the money they earn back somehow to their families in the future, and the entire economy of South Park begins to bend around their presence. The joke is that the show has taken the political argument about Mexican immigration to the United States, dragged it out of the year 2004, dressed it up in science fiction trousers, and then refused to let go of the original reality for a single second. The future people are called Goobacks. The slur the locals use for them is built directly out of a real-world slur, lightly edited. The complaints the local men make about them are word-for-word transcripts of the complaints anti-immigration commentators of the era were making in real life. The town's response is to organize, to stand at the time portal, to shout at the future arrivals, to eventually take what they believe to be increasingly extreme action. The escalation is the trick. The men of the town move through several increasingly absurd phases of activism. They first try to compete with the future workers by doing the same jobs faster and worse. They then try public demonstrations. And finally, in the climax of the episode, they arrive at what they believe to be the only solution left. They reason, in a long discussion, that since the future workers come from a future of poverty, the only way to stop them from coming is to make the future not poor. And the only way they can think of to make the future not poor is to ensure that no children are born at all in the present, so that the future population is drastically smaller. The way they go about achieving this, in the episode, is to begin engaging in same-sex relations with one another. The image the show ends on is the entire male population of South Park, naked, piled into a writhing heap on the lawn outside the town hall, sincerely believing they are saving the world by doing so. That image is the joke. The case the show is making, if you read it generously, is that the logic of the men's anti-immigration position has become so contorted that they have ended up doing the most absurd thing imaginable in pursuit of it. The men do not actually want to think about the underlying causes that drive people across borders. They want a simple enemy at the gate. And when forced to engage with the actual causes, they prefer to do anything, including humiliate themselves on the lawn, rather than examine the basic fact that the people coming through the portal are coming because their lives are unlivable. The episode is, by design, almost impossible to defend in casual conversation. The image is too vivid. The slur is too close to the original. The future workers are drawn, deliberately, with brown skin and ragged clothes. The town's racism is on the screen for almost every minute of the runtime, and yet the show ends, very clearly, with the white men of the town as the figures of ridicule. The criticism lands on them, not on the new arrivals. The future workers are not made to look stupid. They are made to look exhausted. The men of South Park are made to look ridiculous. There is also a smaller, quieter beat I think it is worth mentioning because it tends to get lost in the noise. At a couple of points in the episode, Stan, Kyle, and the other boys are the only characters who try to engage with the future workers as people. They ask them questions. They try to understand. The show does not give them a triumphant arc. The boys' attempt does not stop the men of the town from doing what they end up doing, but the boys are clearly positioned as the moral compass of the episode, and what we are meant to take from it is that the children, again, are seeing the situation more clearly than the adults are. That is a recurring pattern across these racially focused episodes. The grown-ups are usually the problem. The children, even the worst child in the school, often turn out to be the ones the show trusts to look at the situation honestly. That worst child, of course, is Cartman. And Cartman is a problem this script will have to keep returning to, because almost every conversation about race in South Park, sooner or later, lands on him. We will get to the episode where he attempts to dress up as a stereotype to commit a fraud against his best friend. We will get to the episode where he stages an entire production around his hatred of one ethnicity. We will get to the episode where he attempts to become an inner-city teacher, and the episode where he stages a stunt to scam money from poor families. Cartman is the show's most consistent racist. He is also, very clearly, the show's least sympathetic character. The writers have been on record for years that anything Cartman says or does is meant to be the opposite of what the audience should agree with. That is the show's stated position. Whether the audience always reads it that way is a different question, and one we will come back to before the end of the night. Before we get back to Cartman, there is one more early episode in this lineage that deserves a long look, because it is probably the cleanest single example of South Park's allegorical mode applied directly to the subject of racism. The episode is called Ginger Kids, and it aired late in the 9th season, in the autumn of 2005. The premise is that Cartman gives a school presentation on what he claims is a medical condition called gingivitis, which he says afflicts children with red hair, pale skin, and freckles, turning them into emotionless, soulless creatures incapable of being loved. He insists in a perfectly straight-faced lecture to his class that gingers are inherently inferior, that they have no souls, that they are biologically dangerous, and that they must be stopped. The lecture is, of course, a transcription of arguments racist propagandists have made for centuries about every group they have ever targeted, with the targeted group simply swapped out. The episode then takes the next obvious step. Kyle and Stan, mortified by the lecture, decide to teach Cartman a lesson by dyeing his hair red, painting his skin pale, and drawing freckles on his face overnight while he sleeps. When Cartman wakes up the next morning and looks in the mirror, he believes he has caught the condition he was warning against. The point of the joke is that Cartman's racism does not actually require him to have any specific opinions about ginger people. It only requires him to believe that he is on the right side of a line, and the moment he wakes up on the wrong side of that line, he flips immediately. He becomes the leader of a ginger rights movement. He organizes rallies. He demands recognition. He plots, eventually, the elimination of all non-gingers. What the episode is doing, structurally, is showing you the inside of a bigotry from two angles at once. The first angle is Cartman on top, looking down on a group he has invented reasons to despise. The second angle is Cartman on the bottom, looking up at a world that despises the group he is suddenly part of. The show is arguing that there is no meaningful difference in Cartman's behavior between those two positions. He is the same person doing the same thing. The group changes. The hatred travels with him. The deeper point is that bigotry, of the kind Cartman embodies, is not really about the target. It is about the bigot's appetite for hierarchy. And the target is whatever the bigot can convince the room is on the bottom of the ladder this week. That is a sharper argument than the episode is sometimes given credit for. People remember Ginger Kids because of the rally scene, and because of the catchphrase the children used to describe the condition, and because the episode introduced one of the longer-running gags in the show's history. But the underlying idea is genuinely careful. By making the target an absurd one, by making it about hair color and freckles, the show forces the viewer to see the structure of the prejudice without the noise that real prejudice tends to bring with it. You can see the rhetoric, the grievance, the conspiracy theories about powerful people pulling strings, the language of purity and contamination, all of it, stripped of any real-world weight. It is the kind of allegory that works better than a direct lecture would, because it slips around the defenses viewers tend to put up when an episode tells them directly that they should examine their attitudes. The episode also has a strange afterlife, And this is the part that I think is worth lingering on, because it shows you something about how the show's satire travels. After Ginger Kids aired, the catchphrase from the episode about gingers having no souls spread across the internet in the way South Park catchphrases tend to. School children began chanting it at red-haired classmates. There were reports, picked up in several mainstream news outlets in the late 2000s, of organized bullying campaigns targeted at red-haired children that took their name and their iconography directly from the episode. The show, in other words, had constructed an allegory about prejudice that some part of its audience had read as an instruction manual for committing the prejudice it was describing. That afterlife is one of the things South Park's writers have addressed in interviews and on commentaries over the years. The line the show takes when it is asked about this kind of thing is that satire cannot legislate its own audience. Some viewers will always take a joke at face value and run with it, and the alternative of refusing to make the joke is worse than the risk of being misread. Whether you find that argument convincing depends on a lot of things, including how much trust you have in the audience and how much weight you give to the harm done to the children who are on the receiving end of the bullying. The show has not pretended otherwise, it has just kept making the jokes. Ginger Kids was one of the first times that pattern became visible in a way the press noticed, and the show would keep returning to that pattern for the rest of its run. If Ginger Kids is the cleanest allegory the show ever wrote, then the episode that aired 3 years later in the 12th season, an episode called The China Problem, is one of the messiest direct engagements with race the show ever attempted, and the title is the first signal of how messy it is going to be. The misspelling in the title is meant to read in a specific voice. The show is using the opening credits to put a stereotype on the screen in writing before the episode has even started. Whether that is meant as a target or a tool is one of the central questions the episode never quite answers, and the entire half hour wobbles back and forth across that line. The plot is split into two halves. The first half is one of the show's more notorious cold opens. Stan and Kyle are watching the most recent of the Indiana Jones films, and the experience of watching it, the show suggests, is so traumatizing to the boys that they cannot process it. The show then proceeds to dramatize their reaction by literalizing what they believe the directors of the film have done. We see, in cartoon form, the directors of the film, real people, depicted in a graphic and extended assault on the character of Indiana Jones himself. That image is one of the most upsetting things South Park ever put on television. It was deliberately upsetting. It was intended to shock the viewer in the specific way the show implies the new Indiana Jones film had shocked its young protagonists. The directors of the film, both real and famous people, are drawn in the act of doing terrible things to a beloved character, and the show holds on the image for an uncomfortable length of time. I am not going to describe that scene in any more detail than that. I am telling you about it because it is the cold open of the episode, and because everything that follows is built on top of it. The boys, traumatized, retreat into themselves, and the rest of the episode is about how they avoid the world afterwards. The other half of the episode, the half that gives the title its meaning, follows Cartman and Butters. Cartman has decided that the recent Beijing Summer Olympics, which had been held in the real world only a few months before the episode aired, are a sign that China is preparing to invade the United States. He convinces Butters that the two of them are the only ones who can stop the invasion. He dresses up. He affects an exaggerated accent meant to be Chinese. He paints his face. He commits. In other words, every visual stereotype the show could fit into the runtime, and goes off to attempt to infiltrate what he believes to be the local Chinese restaurant in order to gather intelligence on the coming attack. This is the part of the episode that lands the show in trouble in any conversation about how it handles race. The point being made, very obviously, is that Cartman's behavior is the problem. The owner of the restaurant is one of the most weary characters in the episode. He spends most of his screen time politely telling Cartman to leave and trying to run his business. Cartman never picks up on the actual conversation he is having. He is in his own head, in his own conspiracy, and the more the restaurant owner ignores him, the more convinced Cartman becomes that he is onto something. The structure of the joke is that Cartman is the ridiculous one. Anyone who believes a country can be summed up by a stereotype is the figure of fun in this story. The problem with that argument is that to make the joke, the show has to spend the entire runtime putting that stereotype on the screen. Cartman's outfit, Cartman's accent, Cartman's drawings of what he believes the Chinese people are planning. The show is asking the viewer to find Cartman's behavior absurd, which is the same as asking the viewer to look at the stereotype and recognize it as ugly. But the viewer is also being asked to laugh, and the laugh is built out of the same material the recognition is built out of. There is no easy way to separate the two responses. That is the kind of design choice the show has been criticized for years, and the episode is one of the cleanest examples of it. The episode is also the one that famously ends with Cartman attempting to launch a missile, of his own making, at the restaurant, while the restaurant owner finally snaps and addresses the audience in a long speech about how exhausted he is by these accusations. The speech is, depending on how you read it, either the show acknowledging the criticism it knew it would receive for the episode, or a layer of cynicism on top of that acknowledgement. The restaurant owner's monologue lays out his actual life, his actual business, his actual frustrations, none of which look anything like what Cartman has imagined. What the show wants you to remember from the episode is the face of the man who has been talked over for 20 minutes finally getting to speak. Whether that ending earns the rest of the episode is a question critics still argue about. Some viewers find the speech a redeeming move that contextualizes the stereotype as the problem. Other viewers find the speech a fig leaf laid over a long stretch of objectionable comedy. The show's writers, in interviews about the episode, have leaned closer to the first reading. The episode has, for what it is worth, never been pulled from streaming, and it is still available in the standard catalog, which is the show's most consistent answer to the question of which of its episodes it stands behind. 2 episodes later in the same season, the show ran a pair of episodes that take the question of racial profiling and turn it into one of the strangest sustained jokes the writers ever attempted. The first of the 2 is called Pandemic, and it aired in the autumn of 2008. The setup in the first few minutes is innocuous and weird. The boys, looking for a way to make money, decide they are going to become a Peruvian flute band, the kind of band you sometimes see in shopping centers and on city streets playing wooden pipes. The boys dress in ponchos. They pick up wooden instruments. They begin to perform in the local mall. Within minutes of the episode beginning, men in dark suits arrive, accuse the boys of being part of an international conspiracy of Peruvian flute bands, arrest them, and ship them off to a black site in Miami. What the show is doing in the cold open is taking the post-September 11th climate of indiscriminate racial profiling and dropping it onto the most absurd possible target. The men in suits do not care whether the boys are actually Peruvian. They do not care that the boys are children. They have decided, based on the costumes and the instruments, that the boys fit a profile, and the profile is sufficient justification for the arrest. What the writers are after is the way the structure of profiling does not actually care about the truth of the people it is profiling. It cares about the appearance. The boys, dressed up in ponchos as a joke, are treated exactly the way the show suggests real travelers from the Andes are treated in airports. The absurdity of the children's costumes is being used to point at the absurdity of the system. The episode then takes a sharp turn. The boys are sent to Miami, where they are placed in a holding facility full of actual Peruvian flute band members. The performers have been rounded up from all over the world and confined together. The performers explain to the boys, through subtitles and through one tearful monologue, that the Peruvian flute bands have a sacred duty, and that the duty involves performing in public spaces all over the world in order to keep something they call the guinea creatures at bay. Without the performances, the guinea creatures will rise up and destroy civilization. The boys do not believe this at first. By the end of the episode, the guinea creatures have in fact risen up, and the second half of the 2-part story is given over to enormous, cartoonishly enlarged guinea pigs trampling cities around the world. What I want you to notice about this 2-parter, which is called Pandemic and Pandemic 2: The Startling, is that the show takes the most absurd possible premise, hands it to the most marginalized possible characters, and then makes the case that the people who were profiled, mocked, and confined turn out to have been right about what they were doing all along. The Peruvian flute band members are the heroes of the story. The men in suits are the fools. The boys, having dressed up as a stereotype, are forced to live inside the stereotype long enough to learn that the people behind it were not what they had been told the people behind it were. Profiling is wrong, the episode argues, not only because it is cruel, but because it is, in the show's universe, factually wrong. The profilers do not understand the world they think they are protecting. There is a quieter joke nested inside the louder one, and it is the joke that gives the episode its title. The word pandemic in the show is not, as you would expect from a later cultural moment, a reference to disease. It is a reference to the cultural panic about Peruvian flute bands themselves. The newsreaders in the episode keep referring to the pandemic as if it is an epidemic of performers. The show is poking, very gently, at the way mainstream news coverage tends to use the language of disease to describe immigration and racial movement. People are described as flooding in, as spreading, as infecting. The episode picks up that language and applies it to the most non-threatening possible group. And the joke is that the language sounds exactly as ridiculous applied to flute players as it does applied to anybody else. The thought is buried under the guinea pig monster sequences, but it is there if you look for it. The two-parter is also famous, for fans of the show, for being the closest South Park has ever come to doing an actual disaster film. The animation in the second half is much more elaborate than the show's usual style. The cities are detailed, the guinea pigs are detailed. The carnage is detailed in a way the show ordinarily would not bother with. Consistent with the show's general approach, the writers wanted to push the joke about the guinea pigs as far as they could push it specifically because the joke about the racial profiling underneath only works if the guinea pigs feel real. If the threat the profilers were trying to prevent looks small, the profilers look proportionally less ridiculous. By making the guinea pigs into a genuine apocalypse, the show ensures that the profilers, who never saw it coming, look as small as possible. It is a structural choice, and it is the kind of structural choice the show was making routinely by this point in its run. Let me take you back in time again, because there is a Season 7 episode that sits alongside Goobax in the show's series of immigration parables, and it is one of the most direct things South Park ever wrote about race in America's actual history. The episode is called Red Man's Greed, and it aired in the spring of 2003. The plot is one the writers have called, in interviews, a straight inversion. A casino owned and operated by a Native American tribe near South Park is doing well enough that the tribe decides it would like to expand. The expansion they have in mind is enormous, and it requires the demolition of the entire town of South Park itself so that an interstate can be redirected through their property. The tribe approaches the town with a buyout offer. The townspeople reject it. The tribe responds by attempting to drive the town off the land entirely. What the show is doing, and it is doing it with both hands, is taking the long American history of white settlers using money, disease, and force to drive native peoples from their land, and inverting every single piece of that history within the runtime of a single episode. The tribe in the show is the powerful one. They have the money. They have the lawyers. They have the resources. The town is the powerless one. The townspeople do not have leverage. They have only the land they live on and the assumption that the land belongs to them. When the tribe begins to apply pressure, the town discovers that their assumption was thinner than they thought. They have a history they were proud of and a community they loved, and none of that protects them from the bulldozers. The show's reading of this material is not subtle. The people of South Park have been given, for 1/2 hour of television, a small taste of what was done at much larger scale to Native American communities across the continent. The episode does not pretend the comparison is exact. The tribe in the show uses casino money to attempt land seizure. The actual history involves a much wider range of tools. But the structural point the show is making is that the townspeople, when they are on the losing end of a land dispute, suddenly have a much keener sense of what land means, and that this sense was conveniently absent during all the centuries when their ancestors were on the other side. The most quoted moment in the episode is also the moment that has aged worst, and I am going to discuss it in general terms because the specific content of the joke is the kind of thing the show would handle differently today. The tribe, in a desperate attempt to force the town out, intentionally infects the townspeople with a disease, drawing a direct line to the smallpox blankets of historical American settler colonialism. The townspeople fall ill, they cough, they wheeze, they wonder how this could have happened. The disease, in the show, turns out to be the common cold, dressed up to look terrifying. The historical version of this story involved a much deadlier disease, and the townspeople in the show are getting off lightly, and even the lighter version is enough to bring them to their knees. What the episode wants you to feel is that the experience of being on the receiving end of biological warfare is one the people of South Park had never imagined for themselves, and that the absence of that imagination is part of how they ended up where they are. The episode resolves in a way that some viewers found redemptive and others found unconvincing. The townspeople, fighting back, eventually convince the tribe to call off the expansion, and the show ends with a kind of negotiated peace. The writers were not interested in giving the audience a triumphant moment for either side. They were interested in showing what the inverted dynamic looked like, and then in pulling the camera back before anyone had to commit to which side they were rooting for. That choice is consistent with the show's general approach to political stories. It is less interested in arriving at a verdict than in forcing the viewer to sit inside the discomfort long enough to think about it. There is one more thing I want to mention about Red Man's Greed before we move on. The episode includes a casino scene featuring an enormous, sustained sequence in which the men of South Park lose all of their savings playing blackjack, which the casino has tilted against them through dishonest dealing. The depiction of the casino is one the show would, in another episode, almost certainly play as a joke about how casinos exploit the poor in general. In this episode, the show plays it as a joke about how the table has been turned. The townspeople are being exploited. They are powerless. They are addicted. They are losing everything they have, and the show is asking the viewer to look at that image and to think about how it might have felt to be on the other side of the table for 100 years. That image, more than the smallpox joke or the negotiated ending, is the one I think Redman's greed is built around. It is the show, in its blunt way, asking the audience to feel something about a history that most American comedy ignores entirely. The episode I want to take you to next is the one where Cartman, briefly and disastrously, becomes a teacher. The episode is from the 12th season, and it is called Eek a Penis, and it aired in the spring of 2008. The plot is split into two halves. The first half follows Mrs. Garrison, the boys' 4th grade teacher, who at this point in the show is in the middle of a long and convoluted gender storyline. The second half follows Cartman, who, in the absence of Mrs. Garrison, takes over an inner-city classroom in a much rougher school across town and attempts to teach the children there how to cheat at everything. The premise of the Cartman half of the episode is that the school he ends up at is being used by the show as a stand-in for the kind of underfunded urban public school that is regularly the subject of inspirational films, about white teachers arriving to save predominantly black and Hispanic students. The show has gone out of its way to set up the visual cues. The students are mostly children of color, the school is run down, the hallways are violent, the teachers who came before Cartman have failed, and Cartman, in the role of the white savior teacher, arrives with a plan. The plan, as Cartman explains it, is that the only way out of poverty for these children is to learn how to cheat. Cheating, he explains, is the actual mechanism by which successful people get ahead in America, and the system has been rigged for so long that the only honest response is to learn the cheating better than the people doing it. He delivers this speech with the inspirational cadence of every white savior teacher in every film of that genre. What the show is doing, structurally, is one of its purest parodies. The writers are arguing that the white savior teacher genre, which by 2008 had become its own cinematic cliché, is a fundamentally cynical artifact dressed up as an optimistic one. The films in question, the show implies, almost always end with the students being lifted out of their circumstances through some combination of standardized test scores and personal grit. And the underlying systems that produce the circumstances in the first place never appear in those films at all. By having Cartman teach the children to cheat, and by having the cheating actually work. The show is saying out loud what those films will not say. The test scores are the goal. The path to the test scores does not matter. Any film that pretends otherwise is selling a fantasy. The Cartman half of the episode does not end well, in the way Cartman's storylines never end well. The cheating does, in fact, lift the students out of their circumstances, at least within the show's own logic. Their grades improve. They begin to win things. The narrative beats of the inspirational teacher film play out exactly as they would in the source material the show is parodying. And then, as the episode runs out of time, the show pulls back to remind you that Cartman is Cartman, and that whatever good he has done was incidental to whatever he was actually trying to achieve. The white savior teacher is, in some real way, just as self-interested as Cartman, and the cinematic gloss around the genre is doing the same work the cinematic gloss does in any other story about powerful people helping less powerful people. This is also one of the episodes where the show's use of Cartman as a racial caricature delivery system becomes especially clear, and it is worth pausing on. Across the show's whole run, Cartman has affected an extraordinary number of accents and identities. He has impersonated, in various episodes, members of essentially every ethnic group the show has had reason to bring on screen. The writers have argued in commentaries and in interviews that Cartman is the bigot of the show, and that everything Cartman does in this register is meant to be read as the worst possible version of that behavior. The audience is meant to laugh at Cartman, not with him. That argument is held up better in some episodes than in others. In Eek a Penis, it lands cleanly. Cartman is positioned as ridiculous. The students he is teaching are positioned as smarter than he is. The structure of the episode does not require the viewer to find the children themselves funny. They are simply present, looking at Cartman as if he is the most exhausting person they have ever met. The other half of the episode, the Mrs. Garrison half, does something the show would keep returning to over the years. It uses the school's other teachers as a kind of chorus of low-level prejudice. The teachers talk about Garrison's transition in the worst possible language, often without realizing they are doing it. The everyday casual prejudice of nominally well-meaning adults is its own kind of background radiation, and the workplace. Even one as harmless as a primary school staff room is a place where small acts of disrespect happen all day long. That theme does not get the headlines that the inner city school satire does, but it sits there in the episode doing its work while the more obvious satire plays out in the foreground. 3 years later, in the 15th season, the show delivered one of its sharpest pieces of long-form satire about race in America, and the fact that it managed to land that satire while also being an episode about babies addicted to drugs is one of the most South Park sentences I will ever say to you. The episode is called Crack Baby Athletic Association. It aired in the summer of 2011. The plot follows Cartman and Kyle, who together start a business in which they put babies born to crack-addicted mothers into a giant pen and have the babies fight each other for the entertainment of a paying audience. The babies, the show is careful to specify, are mostly children of color. The audience is presented as cheerful, well-intentioned, and largely uncritical of what they are paying to see. The case the show is building becomes clear about a third of the way through the episode, when Cartman and Kyle approach a representative of an organization that is depicted in the show as a transparent parody of the actual organizing body of American college athletics. The representative explains, with great patience and clarity, that the model Cartman and Kyle have built is in fact the same model the organization he represents has been operating for decades. The athletes are not paid. The athletes are paid in the form of scholarships and food and housing, but they do not see the revenue their performances generate. The organization is paid. The schools are paid. The coaches are paid. The advertisers are paid. The athletes are the ones whose names are printed on the merchandise, and the athletes are the only ones who never receive a check. The representative says very plainly that the system is in every meaningful respect a system of unpaid labor, and that the athlete's relationship to the system has a name that the representative cannot quite bring himself to say, but that the show is very willing to imply. That implication is the engine of the entire episode. The show, having set up the parallel between the crack baby business and the college athletics business, then drives the parallel forward until it becomes almost impossible to ignore. The owner of the organization in the show, a man depicted as an exaggerated version of a real coach who was much in the news at the time, is shown living in a beautiful white plantation-style mansion. The show dresses him in white. The show dresses his estate in white. In one of its more pointed visual choices, the show places him in front of a Confederate-style sweeping veranda. The structure of American college athletics is not a contemporary phenomenon. It is a structure with a much older lineage, and the writers want the viewer to look at the visual cues and connect the dots themselves. By the end of the episode, the crack baby business has been sold to the same organization that runs college athletics, and the organization has absorbed the new venture seamlessly into its existing structure. Nothing about the larger system needed to change in order for the crack baby business to fit inside it. The structure was already there. The point is one of the most uncomfortable the show ever made. The modern system is not separable from the older system. The language has changed, but the structure has not, and the people who profit from it are aware of all of this and have made their peace with it. The episode does not arrive at a hopeful ending. It arrives at an honest one. The system absorbs the new product. The babies go to work. The audience keeps buying tickets. I find this episode genuinely impressive. Whatever you think of the show's politics, the construction of the satire in Crack Baby Athletic Association is careful and patient in a way South Park is not usually given credit for. The argument is built incrementally. The implications are layered into the visuals. The ending does not resolve. The audience is invited to look at a system most American sports coverage will not look at directly and to consider what they see. The episode aired in a moment when the question of paying college athletes was just beginning to break into the mainstream sports conversation. Within a decade, the law in many states would change to allow college athletes to profit from their own likenesses. The case the show was making in 2011 would, in a quieter form, eventually win. The show was early on a question that most American comedy did not touch. There is one other note worth adding before we move on, because it is a recurring feature of the show's approach. The episode also includes a long subplot in which Stan and the other boys debate whether their participation in the crack baby business is morally compromised. and several scenes follow them through their internal struggle. The show suggests, in these subplots, that the moral question is not actually a hard one, and that the boys are taking too long to arrive at the answer the audience already knows. This kind of moral hesitation, the kind that takes years to translate into action, is part of how the larger system survives. The show, in its way, is impatient. It has watched the same hesitations play out in American public life for years. It is, in this episode, gently pointing at them and refusing to let them off the hook. If you want to find the moment when the show stopped doing single race-themed episodes and started weaving race through every episode of an entire season, you can find it almost to the day. The episode is called Stunning and Brave, and it premiered the 19th season of South Park in the autumn of 2015. The episode opens with the school's beloved principal Victoria being abruptly fired by the school board and a new principal arriving to take her place. The new principal is named PC Principal. He is large, he is muscular, he wears wraparound sunglasses indoors. He drinks beer in the corridor. He is, in everything but the rhetoric, a fraternity bro of the most aggressive kind. And the rhetoric, when he opens his mouth, is the rhetoric of social justice in its most strident contemporary form. What the show is doing in the premiere of that season, and would keep doing for the rest of that season and the seasons that immediately followed, is dragging the language of mid-2015 progressive activism into the worst possible vessel and watching what comes out. PC Principal does not use the language of justice to think more carefully about the world. He uses it to dominate it. He shouts down anyone who does not match his exact phrasing. He physically attacks Cartman in the corridor for using a slur about Caitlyn Jenner. He uses corrective language as a weapon, not as a tool. The form of the language and the spirit of the language can be separated, the show argues, and the form can be used by people who have no interest in the spirit at all. That argument is one of the most divisive the show ever made, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Some viewers read the PC Principal arc as the show finally pointing at a problem that had gone unnamed in mainstream comedy for years. Other viewers read it as the show using the worst possible caricature of progressive politics to dismiss the broader project entirely. Both readings have a case to make. The show, in the body of the season, tries to thread the needle. Several episodes show PC Principal being absolutely right about an underlying problem. Several episodes show him being absolutely wrong about how to address it. If I had to summarize the show's position in one sentence, the diagnosis can be correct while the prescription is wrong. And the loudest voices on either side of a public controversy tend to be the ones doing the most damage. Where it gets directly relevant to a conversation about racism is in the second episode of that season, which is called Where My Country Gone, and which aired the week after the premiere. In that episode, Mr. Garrison, returning to the show after a long period off-screen, becomes radicalized against the wave of immigration the town has been processing. The immigrants in the episode are drawn as Canadians, who in the visual language of the show have always looked deliberately silly, with floating heads cut in half. By making the targets of the immigration panic into the show's silliest-looking long-running characters, the writers are using the same trick they used in Goobacks. The audience is being asked to look at the structure of the bigotry, not the surface features of the targets. The Canadians are the most non-threatening immigrants the show could possibly have written. Garrison's response to them is full of every rhetorical move that real immigration panic uses. They are taking our jobs. They are changing our culture. They are coming in faster than we can absorb them. They must be stopped. The episode then takes the most controversial step of its run. Garrison's response, as he escalates, becomes more and more directly recognizable as a parody of a real political figure who was, in the autumn of 2015, in the early months of a presidential campaign. The show does not name the figure. The show does not need to. The hair is the hair. The cadence is the cadence. The promise to build a wall is the promise to build a wall. Within the episode, Garrison wins political support from the town by promising the most extreme possible action, and the show implies that the town's support is not really about the wall at all. It is about the feeling of doing something, of being heard, of being told that someone is paying attention to their grievances. Across the episode, and across the season around it, the show was watching two political phenomena rise at the same time and arguing that they were the same phenomenon. PC Principal in the corridor and Garrison on the campaign trail are presented, very deliberately, as mirror images. Both are loud, both are aggressive. Both believe they are correcting an injustice, both rely on a recognizable language, and both, the show implies, are doing damage to the underlying causes they claim to represent. The case is one the show would make in different ways for the rest of the decade, and it is the case that most directly placed South Park in the center of the political conversations of its later run. I want to be careful here, because the show's politics are not the topic of tonight's video. The topic is the way the show has handled race. But it is not possible to discuss the way the show handled race in the second half of its run without discussing the way it handled the political climate around race. The arrival of PC Principal and the rise of Garrison the Candidate are taken together. The show's most direct engagement with the political reality of the late 2010s, and that reality was inseparable from questions of race. The episodes about immigration, the episodes about police violence, the episodes about social justice and free speech. They were all responding in real time to news cycles that had race at their core. By drawing them all through the same two figures, the show was making the case that the whole conversation had become tangled up in a way it did not used to be, and that the original questions had been buried under the loudness of the people answering them. The same season produced an episode that is, in my reading, the show's most quietly upsetting engagement with race in its later run. And it is also one of its most overlooked. The episode is called Naughty Ninjas, and it aired in the late autumn of 2015. The plot is built around a confluence of two threads. The first thread follows the boys, who have decided to begin role-playing as a group of ninjas, complete with costumes and props, and ostensibly Japanese-inspired iconography. The second thread follows the town's adults, who are in the middle of a campaign against their local police department, accusing the officers of a pattern of brutality and demanding their resignation. The two threads, by design, collide in the middle of the episode, and the collision is the entire point. When the boys are seen in their ninja costumes in the local park by adults who are not aware of the game, the costumes are read, instantly and unambiguously, as the costumes of foreign militant fighters. The adults in the town, primed by the news cycle they have been consuming, see four small figures in masks and immediately conclude that the boys are a sleeper cell. The police, who have been driven out of their jobs by the campaign against them, are not present to investigate. The town's response, in the absence of the police, is to mobilize their own ad hoc militia. The people who had been most loudly opposed to the police, when faced with what they believed to be a threat, immediately constructed a worse version of the police out of themselves. That is the argument the episode is built around. The show is taking the moment in the mid-2010s when the national conversation about police violence was at one of its highest pitches and asking what would happen in a town like South Park if the demand for the police to leave were granted. The answer the episode arrives at is uncomfortable. The same townspeople who had marched against the officers were not, the show implies, prepared to live in a community without them. They were prepared to live in a community with a different kind of armed authority. The mob they form is more dangerous than the police they replaced, less accountable, less trained, and faster to act on their assumptions about race. The original problem, the disposition of the people doing the policing, did not actually live with the police. It lived with the people who supported them, and the people who opposed them, and the people who would replace them. The uniform was just a uniform. That argument is one of the harder ones to sit with, and it is one I think reasonable viewers can disagree about. The show is not making the case that the police violence was acceptable. It is making the case that removing the police, without addressing the underlying dispositions of the community, would not solve the problem the violence was a symptom of. Whether you find that argument honest or evasive depends largely on how you read it, and the show's own writers have been careful, in the relatively few interviews they have given about that season, to point at the discomfort of the episode rather than at any single thesis. The episode is structured to leave the viewer uncertain about what to think. That uncertainty is the design. The episode also has, in the background, one of the most pointed jokes about the boys' costumes that the show ever ran. The boys' ninja costumes, when read sympathetically, are the costumes of a children's role-playing game. When read by anyone primed to see a threat, they become the costumes of a foreign militant fighter. By switching between those two readings in different scenes, the show suggests that the meaning of an image is determined more by the viewer than by the wearer. The boys did not change. The costumes did not change. What changed was the news the adults had been watching, and the adults watched what they were primed to watch. The children are, again, the people the show trusts to be honest about what is in front of them, and the adults are, again, the people who project the worst possible reading onto everything. That pattern is one of the show's longest running, and it never stops being relevant. I think it is also worth pointing out that Naughty Ninjas is one of the rare South Park episodes in which no clear villain emerges by the end. The police are not the villain. The mob is not the villain. The boys are not the villain. The town is not the villain. The point being made is structural. The villain, if there is one, is the entire situation, and no individual character can be blamed for it without ignoring the contribution of every other character. That refusal to assign blame is, in my reading, the most honest move the show makes during the entirety of its mid-2010s political run. The show is not telling you who to be angry at. It is telling you that the situation cannot be solved by being angry at anyone in particular, and that the only useful response is the patient and uncomfortable kind. Whether the rest of the season earns that move is a separate question. The episode itself stands as a quieter, sadder piece of work than the show is usually given credit for. The next episode I want to take you through is one of the more genuinely strange entries in the entire run, because it is the show, almost 25 seasons in, going back and retroactively rewriting one of the most basic facts about one of its core characters in order to address a piece of criticism it had been sitting on for the entire history of the series. The episode is from the 25th season, and it was the second episode of that season, and it aired in the early months of 2022. The plot is built around the boys realizing that one of their classmates, Tolkien Black, has had his name pronounced and spelt incorrectly by the entire town for his entire life. Tolkien, the show now insists, is not a reference to coins or to the slang term he had been associated with for 25 years. Tolkien is a reference to the author of The Lord of the Rings. The reveal is delivered with a perfectly straight face. The show informs the audience that Tolkien's parents, who are scholars and lovers of literature, named their son after the author whose work they admired most. The show then walks the boys through a series of conversations in which they realize that they had been hearing the name wrong for years, and that the misspelling and the mispronunciation had quietly altered their understanding of who Tolkien was as a character. As far as the episode is concerned, Tolkien had been a fully developed character all along, and the boys, like the audience, had been failing to see him properly. Whether you find that move charming or evasive depends largely on what you bring to it. The most generous reading of the retcon is that the show is acknowledging, 25 years late, that it had used Tolkien primarily as the show's only black main character, that this usage had often shaded into the kind of cliché the show had spent much of its run satirizing, and that the writers wanted to give the character a piece of background that recoded the entire history of his presence on the show. In this reading, the episode is saying that Tolkien had always deserved better. The least generous reading is that the show was performing a kind of late-stage cleanup, that the retcon was thin, and that one episode could not undo what had been a quarter-century of writing. The truth, I think, is somewhere between those readings. The retcon is thin. It is also sincere. The episode treats Tolkien's parents with more dignity than the show had ever treated them before. It places them in a richly drawn home filled with books. It gives Tolkien himself a long monologue about how it felt to grow up watching his name be misread by everyone he interacted with. The misreading was its own kind of harm, the episode argues, even if the people doing the misreading did not mean any harm by it. Such harm accumulates, slowly, across decades, and the work of repair is the work of going back and naming each thing correctly. There is something poignant about that idea when it is delivered by a show that has been on the air for as long as South Park has. The writers are aware that they have spent more than 2 decades calling a character by a name that was not, in their current telling, his actual name. They are aware that the character had become associated with a particular pattern of stories that often centered on his presence as the school's only black student. They are aware that the original choice to make him wealthy, which they had defended in interviews as a deliberate inversion of cliché, had not, in the long run, prevented Tolkien from becoming the show's representative of a community that the writers themselves were not part of. The episode is the show's most direct acknowledgement that this had not been good enough, and that they were attempting, very late, to revise their own record. I do not think the episode entirely succeeds at what it sets out to do. The retcon does not erase 25 years of writing. Some of those years contain jokes that the show could not, in 2022, write again. But the episode is a meaningful gesture, and it is delivered with the kind of quiet that the show ordinarily does not bother with. There is no loud satire in this one. There is no overblown villain. The argument is built out of small conversations and slow revelations. The work of taking a character seriously is not loud work, and the show, at this point in its run, was capable of doing the quiet kind when it chose to. Whether it would keep doing the quiet kind is a separate question. The episode at least demonstrated that it could. It is worth saying, as a kind of side note, that the show in its later run has begun to do more of this kind of revision. Tolkien has been given a larger role in subsequent specials. Other characters have been given more careful treatments than the show had given them earlier. The writers seem to be saying, very quietly, that the early run of the show was an artifact of its time, and that the later run is allowed to reread the earlier run in the light of what came after. That is the kind of move very few television shows are still around long enough to make. South Park has been on the air for longer than most viewers' children have been alive. It has had time to revise itself. The Tolkien episode is the most visible example of it doing so deliberately. In between the political seasons of the late 2010s and the revisions of the early 2020s, the show produced an episode that takes the question of America's foundational myths head-on, and it is one of the more openly didactic things the show ever did. The episode is called The Holiday Special, and it aired late in the 22nd season, in the autumn of 2018. The plot follows Stan Marsh, who decides, with the casualness only a fourth-grade child can summon, that he would like Columbus Day to be removed from the school calendar and replaced with Indigenous Peoples Day. He raises the suggestion at school. He raises it at home. He raises it at the local council. And the response he receives from the adults around him is not what he expects. Randy Marsh, his father, having spent much of the recent run of the show as the operator of a marijuana farm called Tegrity Farms, is the one who pushes back hardest. The reason Randy pushes back, the episode reveals very quickly, is that Randy is afraid of what a deeper inspection of his family history might reveal. He convinces himself that he might be related to Christopher Columbus, and that the family business might be tainted by an ancestral connection he would rather not acknowledge. Randy then begins a series of increasingly elaborate attempts to suppress the conversation, including, in one of the more bizarre sequences in the run, attempts to take a genetic test in private, to lie about the results, and to bury any evidence that might emerge. What the show is doing in the holiday special, structurally, is taking the abstract argument about whether American history should be told differently and rooting it in a single character's specific fear. Randy is not opposed to telling the story differently in principle. He is opposed to telling the story differently because he is afraid that the telling would implicate him personally, and that the implication would cost him something he cannot afford to lose. The abstract version of the conversation about historical legacy almost always sits on top of a much more personal version. The writers seem to be saying, and the personal version is usually doing the heavy lifting. Randy can debate the politics of Columbus Day all day long. What he cannot do is admit that the politics matter to him because of what they might say about his own family. The episode also includes a long sequence in which Randy attempts to bribe and lie his way out of the consequences of his own genealogy. He fakes documents. He hires a man to impersonate his deceased relatives. He pays for a different version of his family history to be inserted into the public record. The work of revising history is often, at the bottom of it, the work of one family deciding which story they would prefer to belong to. This is not a small thing. Whole national narratives are built out of millions of small decisions of this kind, and the people making the decisions are often more afraid than they are dishonest. The episode resolves in a way that is more melancholy than triumphant. Stan does eventually convince his father, and through his father the town, that the change in the calendar should happen. But the resolution is not framed as a victory. It is framed as an exhaustion. Everyone has been arguing for the entire half hour. No one feels good about the result. The change matters, but the cost of arriving at the change is heavier than the people doing the changing had expected. That tone, in the show's later run, is one of its most consistent. The show is no longer interested in clean endings. It is interested in the texture of the argument that produces the ending, and the texture is, by design, uncomfortable. I think The Holiday Special is one of the show's underrated entries in this whole conversation. It does not have the visual punch of the older episodes. It does not have the celebrity caricatures of the mid-run. It does not, by South Park standards, have a particularly funny premise. What it has is patience. The episode is willing to sit inside Randy's panic for almost the entire runtime and to ask the audience to consider why that panic is shaped the way it is. The conversation about historical figures is rarely actually about the historical figures. It is about the people doing the talking, and the families they belong to, and the stories they would prefer to keep telling about themselves. That, in my reading, is the most honest case the show has ever made about the politics of historical memory. There is also a small thread in the episode about the school children themselves, who are not nearly as troubled by the conversation as the adults are. The students discuss the change. They debate it. They do not feel personally implicated by it. The pattern echoes through every episode in this whole video. The children are once again the ones the show trusts to look at the question clearly. They are not protecting an inheritance. They are looking at a calendar. The adults are protecting an inheritance, and the calendar is incidental. That contrast is the show's oldest move, and it is the move that gives the holiday special its emotional spine. No conversation about race on South Park can avoid the long-running thread of Cartman's anti-Semitism, which has been part of the show since the second season, and which is the most consistent piece of bigotry any character on the show has ever displayed. There is one specific episode in which the writers chose to address it head-on, and that episode is called The Passion of the Jew. It aired in the spring of 2004, and it sits inside the cultural moment of the release of Mel Gibson's film The Passion of the Christ, which had only been in theaters for about a month when the episode went to air. The plot is built around three threads that braid together by the end. Cartman becomes obsessed with the film, watching it repeatedly, and uses it as the basis for an organization he founds called the Mel Gibson Fan Club. Kyle, who has never seen the film, watches it on Cartman's insistence and emerges from the theater racked with guilt, becoming convinced that everything Cartman has ever accused him of must be true. Stan and Kenny, separately, attempt to demand their ticket money back from Mel Gibson himself, traveling to his home in Los Angeles to confront him. The show is doing two arguments at once, and the second argument is the one that survives the test of time. The first argument is the obvious one. Mel Gibson, as written in the episode, is depicted as deeply unwell, a man who paints himself in colors and runs naked through his home and behaves in ways the show clearly considers ridiculous. The writers are suggesting that the film, in their reading, was made by someone whose worldview was outside the mainstream of moral reasoning, and that the seriousness with which the film was being treated was a kind of misreading. Whether you agree with that reading is up to you. The show was not subtle. The second argument is the one I want to spend more time on. As Cartman's fan club grows, the show reveals, gradually, that Cartman has been using the film's themes to recruit people to a movement whose actual purpose is the elimination of the Jewish population of South Park. The members of the fan club, the show is careful to specify, do not initially understand this. They believe they are honoring a religious work. They believe they are gathering to express their faith. Cartman, who has organized them, has a different agenda. The reveal happens in the final act of the episode, when Cartman leads his followers through the town in a march, dressed in costumes that the show draws with deliberate references to the iconography of the regime that ran Germany in the late 1930s and early 1940s. The marchers begin singing, in German, a song whose lyrics, the show subtitles for the audience, are explicit about what the marchers want to do to Jewish people. The argument the final act makes is that the fan club has been radicalized without their knowing. They had been told they were attending a religious gathering. They had ended up at a hate march. Movements of this kind do not usually announce themselves with their actual agenda. They use the language of something else, something more acceptable, something more shareable, and they invite people in under that banner. By the time the banner is replaced with a more honest one, the people are already inside, and many of them, the show implies, will simply go along with the new banner because they do not want to be embarrassed about having joined. The episode ends with the marchers, confronted by Stan and Kyle's intervention, and by Mel Gibson himself, behaving in a way that even his fans cannot defend, breaking up the rally and going home. Kyle, separately, has a long conversation with the rabbi about what he had been feeling, and the rabbi gently brings him back to his own faith. The dual ending suggests that the loud version of the argument and the quiet version of the argument are both being made at once. Cartman's movement, exposed, collapses. Kyle's private crisis of conscience is resolved through conversation rather than through a confrontation. The two responses to a piece of inflammatory media are different, and both responses are needed at the same time. The Passion of the Jew is one of the show's most explicit examinations of anti-Semitism, and it is also one of the more honest. The writers have spoken in commentaries and interviews about the fact that they sat on the script for a long time before deciding to make it, that they were aware of the seriousness of the material, and that they were trying to find a way to be funny about it without diluting the seriousness. Whether they succeeded is a matter of personal judgment. The episode is, by the show's standards, restrained in some scenes and very loud in others. The march in the third act is loud. The conversation between Kyle and the rabbi is quiet. The writers wanted both registers in the same episode, and they were willing to risk the dissonance to get them. It is also worth noting, while we are here, that Cartman's anti-Semitism has been a constant throughout the show, and that the show has, almost without exception, framed it as evidence of his moral failure rather than as a position the writers endorse. By most accounts, Cartman has, in various episodes, attempted to wipe out the Jewish population of the entire continent. He has, in one episode, manipulated a baseball team into building a giant lawn ornament that depicts a parody of anti-Semitic propaganda. He has used slurs against Kyle in almost every episode of the show. The writers have argued, in interview after interview, that Cartman is the show's permanent villain. The audience is meant to find his behavior funny only in the way one finds a permanent villain funny, which is to say at his expense rather than in agreement with him. Whether the audience always reads it that way is again a separate question, and we will come back to it. There is an earlier Cartman episode that fits into this conversation, and it is from the 4th season, so it sits very near to the Chef Goes Nanners episode we discussed earlier. The episode is called Cartman's Silly Hate Crime 2000. The plot is that Cartman, in the middle of a sledding race, hits Token Black in the head with a rock. The act itself, in the world of the show, is one of those things Cartman does to other children all the time. Cartman has hit many of his classmates in the head with many objects across the show's run. But because Token is the only black student in the school, and because Cartman is a white student, the act is classified by the legal system not as a simple assault, but as a hate crime. Cartman is taken into custody and held in juvenile detention pending a hearing. The argument the show is making, very directly, is about the legal category of hate crimes itself. The argument has 2 layers. The first layer, the one most viewers pick up on, is that the show is skeptical of the idea that the same physical act should be punished more harshly when the people involved happen to belong to different racial groups. The show suggests through Cartman's defense team and through several long speeches by his lawyer that the legal category of hate crimes is in some respect inconsistent with the principle of equal treatment under the law. In the year 2000, that was a live argument in American public debate. It is still a live one today. The show was taking a position, and the position was one that not every viewer found congenial. The second layer, the one fewer viewers pick up on, is the more interesting one. The show is, simultaneously, asking the viewer to remember that Cartman is the worst character on the show, and that Cartman is the one delivering this argument. The writers are aware that the argument they are making, in the abstract, is one that can be used by bad faith actors to defend acts that very clearly were motivated by racial hatred. By giving the argument to Cartman, who has been a racist for the entire show, the writers are layering a complication on top of the argument. The viewer is asked to find Cartman's defense persuasive in principle, while also noticing that Cartman is the worst possible person to be making it. That kind of double move is what the show was attempting with increasing sophistication across its early run, and Silly Hate Crime is one of the first times it succeeded at it cleanly. The episode does not arrive at a clean conclusion. Cartman is, in the end, allowed to leave detention, but the show implies that the underlying tensions remain. Token's family is unsettled. The town is unsettled. Cartman is back at school, smug as ever, and ready to do something just as bad next week. The legal system has reached a result, and the result has not actually solved the human problem the act created. The law and the community are not the same thing, and the law cannot do all the work that the community needs done. There is one more wrinkle worth mentioning. Token in this episode is given relatively little to say. He is not the protagonist. He is the victim of the assault, and his recovery is a minor thread. The show would, much later, give Token more dignified treatment in the Tolkien episode we already discussed. In Silly Hate Crime 2000, Token is mostly a plot device. The writers have, in retrospective interviews, addressed this. They have argued that the show in those early years did not always know what to do with Token, that they were figuring out the character over time, and that some of the early episodes treated him in ways the later seasons would not. The show was learning, slowly, what it had not initially understood about how to write a character whose primary narrative function was determined by his race. That learning was uneven, but you can trace it across the show, episode by episode, if you watch carefully. The next thread I want to take you through is the longest single piece of running material the show ever produced on the subject of religion and race together, and it stretches across 3 different episodes spread across 9 years of broadcast history. It is the show's depiction of the Prophet Muhammad. The first appearance of the character is in an episode from the 5th season called Super Best Friends, which aired in the summer of 2001. In that episode, the boys join a group of religious figures from different traditions, a kind of theological superhero team, and the Prophet Muhammad is depicted on screen alongside Jesus, Buddha, Moses, Krishna, Joseph Smith, and Lao Tzu. The character is given a small speaking role. He has, in the world of that episode, the power to control fire. The depiction passed without major controversy at the time. The episode aired, it was discussed, it was not pulled from circulation. What changed is that the world changed. By 2006, when the show Next attempted to put the same character on screen, the international cultural climate around the depiction of the Prophet had become much more contentious. A Danish newspaper had run a series of cartoons depicting the Prophet that had triggered widespread protest. The question of whether and how the Prophet could be depicted had become the subject of news coverage around the world. And the show, never one to shy away from a hot-button issue, decided to make an episode about the controversy itself. The episode was called Cartoon Wars Part 1, and the next week's episode was called Cartoon Wars Part 2. They aired in the spring of 2006. The plot of the two-parter follows the boys as they discover that the cartoon program Family Guy, a real show that aired on a competing network, is preparing to broadcast an episode in which the Prophet Muhammad would appear as a guest character. The town of South Park, fearing reprisal, attempts to prevent the broadcast. The boys, in particular Kyle, end up defending the right of the cartoon to appear on the air, arguing that capitulating to the fear of violence would set a precedent the country would not be able to walk back. The show is making a complicated argument about free expression and self-censorship. The writers were watching the broader American media respond to the international controversy and concluding that the response had been one of caution rather than principle, and that the consequences of caution, in this domain, were larger than the people exercising it understood. The two-parter ends in a way that would later become controversial. The original script, according to interviews the writers have given, depicted the Prophet appearing on screen in an animated segment. Comedy Central, the network that broadcasts the show in the United States, intervened. The animated segment, in the version that actually went to air, was replaced with a black screen and a text card stating that Comedy Central had refused to broadcast an image of the Prophet. As Trey Parker and Matt Stone have confirmed, the writers had wanted to draw the Prophet, and the network had said no. By leaving the text card in the episode rather than reshooting the segment, the writers were forcing the audience to see, in plain text, the place where the censorship had occurred. They wanted the audience to know that a decision had been made above their heads. 4 years later, in the 14th season of the show, the writers revisited the question. The two-part episode in question is the one called 200, with its follow-up 201, and it aired in the spring of 2010. The plot is structured as an anniversary celebration of 200 episodes of the show. It revisits every celebrity the show had ever offended across its run. It revisits the question of whether the Prophet can appear on screen, and it ends, once again, in a censorship event. The original cut of the second part of the two-parter included a sequence in which a character delivers a long monologue about the moral importance of standing up to fear. The version that actually went to air had that monologue, in its entirety, censored out, along with most of the depictions of the Prophet, and replaced with audio bleeps and image bars over the relevant portions of the screen. The show, the writers, and the network have all addressed the events around that broadcast in various interviews and statements over the years. The writers were not, in their telling, given a chance to review the censored version before it aired. The network's position, also according to public statements, was that the censorship had been made in response to concerns about the safety of the show's staff. The two-parter aired in censored form, and the second part has, since 2010, never been made available in any uncensored version on any platform. It is one of a very small number of South Park episodes that has been pulled from streaming entirely and remains unavailable. You cannot watch it. You cannot stream it. You cannot find a clean copy of it. It is, in effect, gone. I want to be careful in how I describe what happened in those episodes, because the writers themselves have made clear that the version of the two-parter the audience saw is not the version they wrote. The case the show was making in the original cut was, according to subsequent interviews, that fear of violence should not be allowed to determine what art is permitted to depict, and that the precedent set by every act of self-censorship makes the next act of self-censorship easier. Whether you agree with that argument is up to you. The episode itself is, in its surviving form, mostly a black bar and an audio bleep. The argument is lost in the silence the network imposed. In its own way, as the writers have made clear in interviews since, the silence is the most eloquent thing the episode ever said. The audience can hear, in the absence of the words, exactly where the line was drawn. This is the closest the show has ever come to being meaningfully prevented from saying what it intended to say, and it sits uneasily inside the conversation about how the show handles race and religion. The writer's line has always been that they treat every religion with the same disrespect, and the depictions of Jesus and Buddha and Moses across the show's run are, in volume terms, at least as numerous and as irreverent as anything that was ever attempted with the prophet. Whether that line settles the matter is something reasonable viewers continue to disagree about. What is not in dispute is that the network drew a line, that the show was forced to broadcast around the line, and that the consequence has been the permanent unavailability of one of its episodes. The point the show was making about self-censorship was, in the most concrete way possible, illustrated by the events that surrounded the broadcast itself. The next episode I want to discuss is one of the more peculiar entries in the show's catalog, because the surface premise is about whaling and the secret premise is about something much older. And the show does not reveal which premise it is actually telling until the very last scene. The episode is called Whale Whores, and it aired in the autumn of 2009 in the 13th season. The plot follows Stan, who, after witnessing what he believes to be a Japanese fishing fleet attacking whales and dolphins, decides to join a real-life ocean activist group to interfere with the fleet at sea. The episode is in part a parody of a reality television program that had been on the air for a few years at that point, depicting the activists' interventions, and the show recreates the cinematic conventions of that program in some detail. What makes the episode strange, and what makes it relevant to our subject tonight, is the reveal in the third act. The show explains, through one of the most baroque pieces of expository animation it has ever attempted, that the Japanese cultural focus on whaling is not, in the world of the show, an organic outgrowth of historical food culture. It is the result of a propaganda campaign that began at the end of the Second World War. By most accounts of the episode, the show suggests that an American figure embedded an altered photograph in a wartime newspaper showing whales and dolphins, rather than cows and chickens, being responsible for the destruction at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese people of the show, having seen the altered photograph, have spent the 70 years since the war taking revenge on the wrong species. The argument the show is making is genuinely strange and quite specific to South Park. Historical grievances, including the grievances that drive entire cultural practices across generations, can be the result of misunderstandings that no one alive remembers the origin of. The argument is not, despite the unfortunate stereotyping in the surface plot, that Japanese people are foolish. The argument is that any culture, given long enough and a sufficiently confused starting point, will continue practicing the consequences of a misunderstanding long after the misunderstanding itself has been forgotten. The activist program being parodied, with its assumption that they were dealing with a malicious culture, is itself a kind of mirror image misunderstanding. The Japanese people, in the world of the show, are not malicious. They are operating off of a piece of bad information that no one has had the chance to correct. Whether you find that argument respectful or not is a matter of personal judgment. The episode does include extensive caricatures of Japanese characters, drawn in styles that the show would not be allowed to draw on broadcast television in many other contexts. The writers have argued in interviews about the episode that the cultural references are meant to be read as signals that the show is dealing in stereotypes deliberately rather than accidentally, and that the deliberate use of stereotypes is meant to direct the viewer's attention to the stereotype itself. Whether that argument lands is again a matter of personal judgment. The episode itself has remained available on streaming, and it is generally considered, in critical writing about the show, to sit closer to the show's more thoughtful entries than to its more careless ones. Some viewers find the third act revelation the most charming piece of the writing. Some viewers find the surface caricatures impossible to look past. Both readings have a basis. As far as fans have pieced together, the episode also includes a smaller subplot involving a relative of Stan's who turns out to have a personal history with the activist program being parodied, and who delivers a small monologue near the end of the episode about how the meaning of a long-held grievance can shift across generations. The people who carry grievances forward are not always aware of why they are carrying them, the subplot suggests, and the maintenance of an inherited hatred is often the hardest piece of an inherited identity to set down. The argument the show is making, in the quieter beats, is one of its more humane. The work of letting go of an inherited grievance is the work of a generation, and the generation in question rarely lives to see the work completed. That argument, oddly enough, fits inside an episode whose surface premise is about whaling, and it is one of the reasons the episode tends to be remembered better than its surface plot would suggest. I think Whale Whores is also a good demonstration of one of the show's most consistent structural choices. The show very rarely tells you, on the surface, what it is actually arguing. The surface is a parody. The surface is loud. The surface is the joke. The argument tends to live one or two layers down, in the structure of the episode, in the way the jokes are arranged, in the order of the reveals. A viewer who watches the show looking at the surface will come away with a different sense of what the show is doing than a viewer who watches the show looking at the architecture underneath. The episodes about race, especially the ones we have been discussing tonight, almost all reward this second kind of viewing. The first kind of viewing is what fuels most of the controversies the show has ever attracted. The second kind of viewing is where the writers seem to actually live. I want to take you back to the year 2005 for the next episode, because that is the year of Hurricane Katrina, and the episode the show produced in the wake of Katrina is one of its most carefully constructed engagements with race in modern American disaster. The episode is called 2 Days Before the Day After Tomorrow, and it aired in the autumn of 2005, only weeks after the actual hurricane made landfall on the Gulf Coast. The plot is set in motion when Stan and Cartman cause a boating accident that destroys a dam upstream of the town of Beaverton. The town is flooded. The boys, panicked, attempt to cover up their involvement. As the news of the flood spreads, the rest of the country begins to debate, on television, who is responsible for the disaster. The case the show is building is about the substitution of blame for response. As the days pass and the floodwaters do not recede, the national conversation, as the show stages it, fails to focus on what should be done for the people in the flooded town. The conversation focuses, instead, on identifying which group of people is to blame for the flood having happened in the first place. Different cable news pundits in the episode propose different theories. The argument is made that the dam failed because of a federal government conspiracy. The argument is made that the dam failed because of climate change. The argument is made that the dam failed because of immigrants. The argument is made that the dam failed because of racism, with the suggestion that the racism in question was an obstacle to the rescue effort. None of the proposed theories actually explain the situation. All of them generate hours of television. The show is pointing very directly at the news coverage of an actual disaster in 2005, the real one that had inspired the episode, and arguing that it had spent its energy on the same kind of substitution. The question of who to blame for a disaster is, in the moment, the wrong question. The right question is what to do for the people inside the disaster. The right question requires action. The blame question requires only commentary. And the cable news ecosystem is more comfortable with commentary than with action. And the people inside the flooded town pay the price for that preference. What makes the episode relevant to our subject tonight is the explicit way the show handles the question of race within the substitution. One of the major pundits in the episode argues, repeatedly and with increasing certainty, that the flood is the responsibility of George Bush, and that the responsibility is racial in nature. The argument, as the pundit makes it, is, intentionally, indistinguishable from a real argument that had been made by a real musician on a real benefit broadcast only weeks before. The show is recreating, almost verbatim, the most famous television moment of the immediate post-Katrina period. And the show, having recreated it, then asks the audience to consider what the moment did, structurally, for the people who were actually inside the flood. The moment, however correct or incorrect in its underlying claim, did not deliver supplies, did not redirect evacuation, did not change the federal response. It generated a headline. And the headline was, in the show's reading, what people remembered, rather than the situation it was a response to. I think the episode is one of the harder ones to discuss, honestly, because the show is not arguing that racism played no role in the Katrina response. The show is arguing that the substitution of the racism conversation for the rescue conversation was its own kind of failure. Whether you find that argument compelling depends on what you bring to the episode. The writer's position, as far as it is articulated, is not that the racism question is irrelevant. The writer's position is that the timing of the question, the way the question crowded out other questions, made it harder to do the work the moment actually required. The work of confronting racism in disaster response is necessary, but not necessary in the form of a televised argument while the disaster is still ongoing. Whether the show's position is fair is a matter of personal judgment. The episode itself is one of the most carefully timed pieces of topical satire in the show's history. It aired close enough to the actual events that the audience could not have forgotten them. It used the proximity as a feature of the writing, not a coincidence. The episode also includes one of the show's stranger payoffs. The boys, who have spent the episode hiding their responsibility for the flood, eventually come forward and confess. The town does not punish them. The confession was, in the end, more useful than the months of substitution had been. In its smallest possible form, the show is suggesting that the truth of who is responsible for what is often available to anyone willing to look, and that the long substitution that filled the airwaves had been a way of looking everywhere except at the boats. Whether you read the resolution as triumphant or merely tired is, again, up to you. The episode does not push you in either direction. It just shows you the resolution and lets you decide what to make of it. The next episode I want to discuss is the one where the show first set out to argue, in detail, about the meaning of the words a culture is allowed to say out loud. The episode is called It Hits the Fan, and it premiered the 5th season of the show in the summer of 2001. The plot is built around the announcement that a major American television drama is going to broadcast. On a regular evening, an episode in which a single word of profanity will be spoken. The word is one the broadcast networks had been refusing to air for decades. The episode in the show treats the announcement as a national event. People organize viewing parties. People discuss what it will mean. People speculate about what other words might follow. And after the word airs on the broadcast, the show begins to depict a series of supernatural consequences. People who say the word too often begin to develop terrible afflictions. The word, it is revealed, has been forbidden for centuries by an ancient council of knights who guarded the secret of which words could be safely spoken and which could not. The episode is, on its surface, about a specific word that does not appear in our subject tonight in any meaningful sense. But the episode is also, structurally, about something larger. The case the writers are building is about the relationship between the use of a word and the weight of the word. Words gain power, in a culture, by being held back from common use. And the use of a word in a public broadcast can drain its power across an entire population over time. The argument applies, the show implies, to any number of words a culture might place under restriction, and the racial slurs the show has discussed in other episodes are explicitly part of the broader category the writers are interested in. The reason It Hits the Fan is relevant to a discussion of the show's race episodes is that it lays out, very plainly, the theory of language the writers seem to bring to every subsequent episode in which a slur or a difficult word appears. The argument is that the words themselves carry power that does not survive overuse. In subsequent episodes, the writers are not in favor of overusing such words, and the careful, sparing, deliberate use of a word like the one Randy Marsh shouts on Wheel of Fortune is meant to draw on the word's preserved weight rather than to drain it. With apologies to Jesse Jackson would not work if the word had become drained. It works because the word still hurts. The argument the writers were making in It Hits the Fan is that this kind of preservation is itself a deliberate cultural choice, and that the choice is being made or unmade every time a network executive decides what to broadcast. I think this episode is also one of the better examples of how the show's stated theory about language meets, and sometimes collides with, its actual practice. The show, across its run, has been willing to put words on screen that other shows would not. The writers have, in interviews and commentaries, defended that willingness by appealing to the kind of theory of language the It Hits the Fan episode lays out. They argue that the words have power, and that the show is using the power deliberately. Whether the use of the power has always been deliberate is a separate question, and one that critics of the show have raised many times across its history. The show's defenders point at the careful structural moves in episodes like With Apologies to Jesse Jackson. The show's critics point at the moments in which the deliberate use seems to have shaded into a less deliberate use. Both readings have their evidence. The argument, like most arguments about the show, is one viewers will continue to disagree about for as long as the show continues to be available. There is one moment in It Hits the Fan that I want to highlight, because it sits at the center of the theory the show is laying out. Near the end of the episode, the ancient Council of Knights reveals the existence of a much darker, forbidden word, one that has been buried so deep in the show's universe that even speaking of its existence is forbidden. The words have a hierarchy, the show argues. Not all forbidden words are equally weighted, and the most weighted of them all is one no character in the show is willing to say. Even within a system that has eroded over time, certain words remain protected by an active and continuing taboo. The rest of the show's run bears this out. The writers believe in the taboo and have been writing inside it for the entirety of their careers. They are not interested in saying every word. They are interested in the words they choose to say, the words they choose not to say, and the texture of the choice. In the 6th season, the show produced an episode that takes the question of tolerance, the concept that PC Principal would much later weaponize, and inspects it from the opposite end. The episode is called The Death Camp of Tolerance, and it aired in late autumn of 2002. The plot follows a teacher, Mr. Garrison, who at this point in the run has decided to come out as a gay man and who has, the show implies, an ulterior motive in doing so. Garrison wants to be fired in a way he can sue the school district over. To accomplish this, he begins behaving in his classroom in increasingly outrageous ways, expecting that the school will fire him for the behavior and that he will then be able to sue them for discrimination. The school, however, refuses to fire him. The school administrators interpret every act of misbehavior as an expression of his identity, and they conclude that punishing the behavior would constitute a violation of his rights. Garrison's antics escalate. The school's tolerance escalates with them. By the end of the episode, the children, who have been subjected to a sustained pattern of misconduct, are sent to a camp designed to teach them the importance of accepting it. The case the show is building is that the word tolerance, used in its strongest contemporary form, can be made to mean the opposite of what its plain English meaning suggests. Tolerance is a passive virtue. It means putting up with things. It does not mean approving of things. Confusing the two leads to outcomes nobody wants, in which acts of misconduct go unaddressed because addressing them would seem intolerant, and in which the people on the receiving end of the misconduct are taught to tolerate it as a moral duty. By depicting the camp itself in iconography drawn from a much darker part of 20th century history, the show implies that the abuse of the concept of tolerance can take a cultural form that is itself the opposite of what the original concept was intended to prevent. The Death Camp of Tolerance is one of the show's most argued about episodes in this whole catalog. The case the writers are making is not one many viewers fully agree with. The show is essentially arguing that the modern usage of tolerance in its strongest forms can collapse the distinction between accepting people and accepting actions, and that the collapse is doing damage. Whether you agree with the underlying argument is, again, a matter of personal judgment. The episode itself is one of the more carefully argued the show ever produced. The writers were aware that the position they were taking would not be universally welcomed. The iconography is, deliberately, designed to make the argument feel uncomfortable rather than easy. The show is asking the viewer to consider whether they can hold two ideas at once. The first idea is that people deserve to be respected regardless of their identity. The second idea is that actions can still be evaluated regardless of who is performing them. The modern conversation has sometimes failed to hold both ideas at once, the show suggests, and the failure has costs. The reason I am including this episode in a conversation about race is that the show's later run, especially the PC Principal years, would essentially keep arguing the same point in different forms. The case the show was making in 2002 about the difference between tolerance as a virtue and tolerance as a weapon would become the show's central political theme by 2015. The writers had been worried about this confusion for a very long time, and the rise of new institutional language around tolerance and inclusion in the mid-2010s did not invent their concerns. The writers were already in this conversation a decade earlier. They have been in it ever since. Whether their position has held up across the years is something each viewer will judge differently. The position itself, at least, has been consistent. I also want to mention, as an aside, that the Death Camp of Tolerance is one of the more visually intense episodes the show ever produced, and the imagery in the camp itself is part of why people remember it. The show is using the iconography of a real 20th century atrocity as a metaphor for an abstract argument about contemporary language. The metaphor is deliberately uncomfortable, and the discomfort is the point. The writers are not, in my reading, trivializing the real history. They are using the visual weight of the real history to make their argument feel as serious as they wanted it to feel. Whether that is an acceptable use of the imagery is, like everything else about this show, something reasonable viewers can debate at length. The same 11th season that gave us With Apologies to Jesse Jackson also gave us an episode called The Snook, which aired a few weeks later in the spring of 2007. The episode is, on its surface, a parody of the action thriller television program that was, at the time, the dominant high-tension thriller on American television. The plot follows Cartman, who has decided that the new student in his class, a boy named Bahir, must be a terrorist because of his ethnicity. Cartman launches a campaign to investigate Bahir, attempting to convince the federal authorities that he has discovered a sleeper cell in South Park. The authorities, exhausted by Cartman's calls, but eventually moved by the persistence of his claims, take action. They detain Bahir's family. They search his home. They begin a series of investigations across the town. On the surface, the show is making a familiar argument from the post-September 11th period. The climate of fear in the country had encouraged ordinary citizens to view their neighbors as threats based on superficial characteristics. The institutions of the state had been willing to act on the resulting accusations, and the consequences for the people on the receiving end of the accusations were severe and disproportionate. Bahir in the episode is not in fact a terrorist. He is a child. His family is not in fact a sleeper cell. They are a family. The damage Cartman's accusations do to them, even in the world of a cartoon, is presented as real. The show then takes a twist in the third act that complicates its own argument. While Cartman has been pursuing Bahir, the show reveals an actual terrorist cell has in fact been operating in the town, and the cell has been operating right under Cartman's nose without him noticing. The actual cell is made up of people Cartman would never have suspected. In some cases, people who look very different from the profile Cartman had been operating with. By the end of the episode, the show is arguing that the racial profiling Cartman has been doing has not only damaged an innocent family, it has, structurally, made the town less safe because Cartman's resources have all been spent on the wrong target. The actual threat was free to operate while Cartman was busy harassing his classmate. That argument is, in my reading, one of the show's most carefully made about the structural failures of racial profiling. Profiling is not merely cruel, it is also tactically counterproductive. The resources directed at the wrong target are resources unavailable for the right one, and the unavailability has consequences. The show is not asking the audience to feel sorry for Bahir on its own. It is asking the audience to consider that the cost of harassing Bahir is paid in two ways: in the harm to Bahir's family and in the failure to find the actual threat. The two costs together are the show's complete argument about profiling. Even people who do not particularly care about the first cost should care about the second one, because the second one places everyone in greater danger. The episode also includes a long sequence in which Hillary Clinton, the real person, is depicted as the target of the actual terrorist plot. The show was, at the time, very interested in the question of whether the country was prepared to elect its first female president, and the depiction of Clinton is unflattering in some of the typical South Park ways. The show was not endorsing any particular candidate. It was using the candidate's presence in the episode to elevate the stakes of the terrorist plot itself. Whether the depiction is fair is something each viewer can judge for themselves. The episode itself does not arrive at a political conclusion about Clinton. It arrives at a political conclusion about Cartman, which is that Cartman, given a serious investigation to conduct, will do it badly because of his prejudices. Bigotry of this kind is not merely a moral failure, it is a kind of incompetence. I think The Snook is one of the show's underrated political episodes, and it tends to be remembered for the Hillary Clinton material, when in fact the more important argument the episode is making is the one about Bahir. The show was, in the spring of 2007, making a quite direct argument about how the country was treating its Arab and South Asian residents in the wake of the previous decade's catastrophic events. The treatment had not made anyone safer and had hurt many people. The country would have to make a different set of choices if it wanted both safety and decency. Whether the country made those choices is a matter of personal judgment. The argument the show was making is, in retrospect, one of the more clearly articulated of its run. The episode I want to take you to next is one that often gets overlooked in conversations about the show's race material, because it sits inside a much louder thread about smugness. But it is one of the more pointed pieces of writing the show ever produced about the relationship between liberal coastal identity and its own assumed moral superiority. The episode is called Smug Alert, and it aired in the spring of 2006 in the 10th season. The plot is set in motion when Kyle Broflovsky's family decides to move from South Park to San Francisco, because Gerald Broflovsky has become convinced that the people of South Park are too unenlightened to live among. The decision is presented by Gerald as a moral one. He believes the family deserves better. He believes his children will grow up in a more sophisticated environment if they go to a place where the political values match his own. The argument the show is making about the move itself is a careful one. It is not that Gerald is wrong to care about the values he cares about. It is that Gerald has confused his caring about those values with a moral superiority over the people who do not share them, and that the confusion is itself the problem. The episode then takes the structure of the move as an opportunity to explore what happens to a community when the people who care most about its improvement leave it for somewhere they consider more comfortable. The community is worse off. The people who needed the disagreement have lost a source of it, and the people who moved away have built themselves an echo chamber whose acoustics will eventually deafen them. The literal joke the episode runs on is that San Francisco, in the show, is choking to death on its own smog. The smugness of its residents has become a physical pollutant in the air. The cloud of smog is depicted as a kind of weather phenomenon, gathering and growing as more self-satisfied people arrive in the city. By the end of the episode, the cloud is large enough to threaten neighboring cities and entire regions. Smugness, of the kind the show is targeting, is a contagious condition with environmental consequences, and the people producing it cannot smell it on themselves. What makes the episode relevant to our subject tonight is the way the show handles the question of who, exactly, is the target of the smug. Throughout the episode, the targets are mostly the residents of South Park itself, who are coded across the show's run as politically conservative, religiously inclined, and rurally located. The smug targets them. The smug believes they are beneath consideration. The smug believes that its own values are not only correct but obvious, and that anyone who fails to share them must be doing so out of malice or ignorance. The assumption of obviousness is itself a form of failure to engage. The people doing the assuming are not, in fact, doing the work the values they claim require. They are doing the easier work of considering themselves above the work. I think this is one of the most important episodes in the show's whole run for understanding how the writers see the political conversations around race that the show participates in. The conversation has been corrupted, on multiple sides, by the unwillingness of its participants to consider the conversation as one that requires effort. Bigotry of the kind the show has spent 20 episodes worth of material satirizing is one symptom of the corruption. And the smug certainty of the people who think they have already moved past bigotry is another symptom of the same corruption. The two symptoms are different. The underlying condition in the show's reading is shared. Both groups have stopped doing the work of actually thinking about the conversation because both groups believe they already have the answer. That argument, to be clear, is the show's argument. It is not necessarily mine, and it is not necessarily yours. The show has been making it for years, and viewers continue to disagree about it. The relevant fact for our subject tonight is that the show's race episodes, taken together, sit inside a larger argument about American public conversation, and that the larger argument is the frame the writers seem to bring to every individual episode. The race episodes are not isolated experiments. They are pieces of a single ongoing argument about how the country talks to itself. And Smug Alert is the episode that most clearly names the larger frame. We cannot have this conversation without spending time on Chef, who was for 9 seasons the most prominent black character in the show, and whose departure remains one of the most discussed events in the entire run. Chef was voiced from the show's beginning by Isaac Hayes, the soul musician and actor whose voice had been one of the defining sounds of American popular music in the 1970s. The character of Chef was the school cafeteria worker, the boys' confidant, the adult most often willing to listen to their problems, and across the show's first 9 seasons, he was given some of the most heartfelt material the show ever wrote. The writers have argued, in interview after interview, that Chef was the only adult in the town the boys trusted, and the only adult the audience was meant to trust. The character was, in their telling, one of the moral anchors of the early show. In the 9th season of the show, in the autumn of 2005, the writers produced an episode called Trapped in the Closet, which depicts in detail the practices and beliefs of the Church of Scientology. The episode was widely covered in the press at the time. It was also, according to public statements made afterwards, deeply offensive to Isaac Hayes, who was at the time a practicing Scientologist. As far as fans have pieced together from the public record, in the months following the broadcast, Hayes was announced to be leaving the show, citing objections to the way the religion had been depicted, though some accounts since have suggested the circumstances around the statement were complicated by his health and by people speaking on his behalf. His departure from the cast was, by any measure, a serious moment for the show. The writers responded in the first episode of the 10th season, in the spring of 2006, with an episode called The Return of Chef. The Return of Chef is one of the show's most discussed episodes for a reason that is impossible to discuss without describing what happens in it. The episode depicts Chef returning to South Park after a period away, behaving strangely, having been recruited by a fictional organization the show calls the Super Adventure Club. The Super Adventure Club is depicted, in the episode, as engaging in practices that the show suggests are predatory and exploitative, especially towards children. Chef, in the world of the episode, has been altered by his time with the organization. The boys attempt to rescue him. The rescue fails. Chef, in the climactic sequence of the episode, dies in a graphic and prolonged accident on a bridge. The argument the show was making, in producing this episode, has been the subject of years of subsequent commentary by the writers themselves and by the press. The writers' stated position has been that they wanted to give Chef a final story rather than simply removing him without explanation, and that the story they wrote was their response to the departure of his voice actor over the question of the show's depiction of religion. They viewed the departure as a moral failure on the part of the voice actor, and they were willing to depict their view of it in the form of the character's fate. Whether you find that argument fair is a matter of personal judgment. The episode has remained one of the most controversial in the show's run, and it has remained available in the standard catalog without alteration. What makes the Chef storyline relevant to our subject tonight is the structural consequence of his removal from the show. For the 9 seasons that Chef was a regular character, the show had at least one significant black adult in the town, voiced by a black actor who was given regular and serious material. After Chef's departure, the show was left with Tolkien, then known as Token, as its only significant black recurring character, and Tolkien was a child. The structural change meant that the show, after 2006, had fewer tools available to it for the kind of stories that had involved Chef in the earlier seasons. Some of the limitations of the show's later approach to race, in my reading, trace back to this structural change. Having lost the actor they had built their main black character around, the writers did not replace him with a comparable presence. The town in the years since has had a much thinner black cast than it had in the early run. That is a fact about the show that the writers have not discussed at length in interviews, but it is one that critics of the show have pointed at repeatedly. The argument the critics have made is that the absence of Chef shaped the show in ways the show itself has not entirely accounted for. The argument the show's defenders have made is that the loss of Chef was a single specific event with a specific cause, and that the absence of a comparable replacement was a consequence of the writers not finding another performer they wanted to build around. Both arguments contain a piece of the truth. The fact remains that the show after Chef's departure is, in measurable terms, a show with fewer black voices in it than the show before his departure had. That is a piece of the show's race story that any honest discussion of the topic has to include. There is a quieter episode from the 4th season that I want to take you through next, because it sits inside a different conversation about race that the show has returned to many times over the years. The episode is called Cherokee Hair Tampons, and it aired in the early summer of 2000. The plot follows Kyle, who has been diagnosed with kidney failure and who needs a transplant in order to survive. Stan, his best friend, frantically searches for a donor. Sheila Broflovsky, Kyle's mother, refuses the standard medical advice and instead takes Kyle to a New Age herbal medicine shop run by a man and a woman who claim to be of Native American descent and who claim that their herbal products contain ancient cures unknown to mainstream medicine. The argument the show is making in the episode is one it would return to in different forms many times over the years. The owners of the shop are not, in fact, of the descent they claim. They are presented, very clearly, as white people who have constructed an identity around a particular kind of borrowed mysticism, and who are using the borrowed identity as a commercial advantage. The herbal products they sell do not actually cure anything. The cultural authority they claim does not actually exist. The customers who walk into the shop are buying a fantasy that the shop owners have built out of pieces of a real culture they have no relationship to. The case the show is making is about cultural appropriation in its purest commercial form. The appropriation is not a victimless act, even when no one in the room is from the culture being appropriated. It generates a false picture of the culture in question that the customer then carries with them into their next encounter with someone who actually belongs to that culture. The false picture is, in itself, harmful, even when the people producing it believe they are doing something respectful. The shop owners in the episode are not depicted as malicious. They are depicted as cheerfully delusional. The delusion is doing more harm than malice would, because the delusion is harder to confront. The episode is also notable for one of the show's harshest treatments of a parent character. Sheila Broflovsky, in this episode, is depicted as so committed to the New Age path that she puts her own son's life at risk by refusing the medical care he requires. The cultural appropriation in the herbal shop is upstream of a much larger problem. The people who buy the fantasy have, by the act of buying it, been taught to mistrust the established sources of help that might actually save their lives. The fantasy makes them vulnerable in ways the shop owners themselves do not understand, and the customers themselves do not see. Sheila's near-catastrophic decision is the consequence the show wants the audience to feel. The episode resolves with Kyle being saved through a different intervention, and Sheila eventually returning to a more conventional medical path. The resolution is not that the New Age framework is harmless when it works. It is that the framework was always going to fail Kyle, and that the question was only whether the failure would happen in time to be corrected. The cultural appropriation and the medical danger are connected, the show argues. The marketing of the first creates the conditions for the second, and the people upstream of the situation, the shop owners, bear a kind of responsibility that they would never recognize in themselves. Bigotry of the kind the show is interested in does not always announce itself as bigotry. Sometimes it announces itself as a small business selling herbal products on a quiet street. I think Cherokee hair tampons is one of the more thoughtful early episodes in the show's run on this topic, and it tends to be remembered for its visual gags rather than for its argument. The shop's products are absurd. The customers are absurd. The owners are absurd. But the argument underneath all of the absurdity is careful, and it is one of the first times the show made a sustained case for taking cultural appropriation as seriously as the more obvious forms of bigotry. The writers had been thinking about this category for a long time, and the show would continue to return to it in different forms across the run. The herbal shop is the first version. The wealthy black families are a different version. The Peruvian flute bands are a different version. The holiday special is a different version. The show keeps walking around the same question, looking at it from different angles, and Cherokee hair tampons is one of the first times it stopped and held a single angle for an entire episode. Before we close, I want to spend some time on the recurring character at the center of so much of this material, because the pattern of his behavior across more than 2 decades of episodes is the single longest piece of racial writing the show ever produced. The character is Eric Cartman, and Cartman, in the strict counting of the show's catalog, is the single most racist character in American animation history. He is racist in almost every direction the show can point him in. He has, at one point or another, expressed contempt for almost every ethnic, religious, and national group the show has had the opportunity to bring into a script. The writers have framed Cartman, in interviews and on commentaries, as the show's permanent villain. He was designed to be the worst person any of the boys could possibly be friends with, and his presence in the group is the show's way of asking what it would mean to grow up alongside someone like that and never quite be able to get away from him. The pattern of Cartman's bigotry is consistent across the seasons in ways that, if you watch the show in order, become genuinely impressive. He uses slurs against Kyle in almost every episode of the show. He treats Tolkien differently than he treats his white classmates, and the show makes the difference clear without spelling it out. He has, in various episodes, dressed up as nearly every ethnic stereotype the show has had the chance to dress him up as. According to fans who have cataloged his schemes, he has, in one episode, attempted to wipe out the Jewish population of an entire continent through a scheme he believed would solve a personal financial problem. He has, in another episode, started a fan club whose actual purpose he hides from its members until it is too late for them to extricate themselves. He has, in another episode, attempted to take over an underfunded school by teaching the students that the only way to succeed in a rigged system is to learn to cheat better than the people rigging it. What makes the pattern interesting is the consistency of the show's framing. The show very rarely allows Cartman to win in the long term. He achieves short-term victories in many episodes. The short-term victories are often the engine of the joke, but the structure of the show implies, episode after episode, that Cartman is the figure whose worldview the audience is meant to find unworkable. The other boys often suffer because of him. The other characters often suffer because of him. The town often suffers because of him. And the resolution of an episode, almost without fail, includes a moment in which Cartman's actions are revealed to have produced costs he had not anticipated, and the costs are usually paid by people other than him. The case the show is making is consistent. Bigotry of the kind Cartman embodies is not just morally wrong, it is materially destructive to the bigot, to the targets, to the community, and the show keeps showing the destruction so the audience can keep noticing it. The complication, which the show has not always handled cleanly, is that the audience is also asked to laugh at Cartman's antics throughout the runtime. In defending this choice, the writers have argued that the laughter is the price of the satire. Satire of the kind they are attempting requires the figure being satirized to be funny in order to be effective. A villain who is merely repugnant does not draw the audience close enough to inspect him. A villain who is funny pulls the audience closer, and the audience, having gotten close, is then asked to recognize the cost of what they are laughing at. Whether the show always pulls off that move successfully is, again, something viewers can debate. The show's defenders point at the pattern of consequences. The show's critics point at the moments when the laughter seems to be allowed to stand alone. Both readings have a basis. I think the most honest thing I can say about Cartman, after watching as many of the relevant episodes as I have for this video, is that the writers seem to be aware of the difficulty of the move they are making, and have spent the entire run of the show attempting to make it more carefully rather than less. The early Cartman episodes are blunter. The later Cartman episodes are stranger and more layered. The pattern of his behavior is the same. The framing of the pattern has slowly become more complicated. The writers have been refining their approach to their own most difficult character over the course of decades. That refinement is one of the more genuinely interesting structural features of the show, and it is one that people who only encounter the show through clips and screenshots tend to miss. The argument the show is making about Cartman lives across the run, not within any single episode. When you take all of these episodes together and place them side by side on the same shelf, a pattern emerges that the individual episodes do not always communicate on their own. The show, across its entire run, has been making a single argument about racism in America, and the argument has been remarkably stable for as long as the show has been on the air. The argument has 3 pieces, and the 3 pieces lean on each other for support. The first piece of the argument is that the most visible forms of bigotry, the ones built around slurs and flags and screaming on a stage, are not actually the most dangerous forms. The visible forms are dangerous because they make the underlying conditions worse, but the underlying conditions exist whether the visible forms are present or not. The work of fighting bigotry is not finished by removing the slurs from the air. The work continues underneath, in the places that did not change when the slurs went quiet. The second piece of the argument is that the well-meaning attempts to address bigotry can produce their own kinds of harm, and that the harm is often felt most by the people the attempts were supposed to help. The case is not that the attempts should not be made. The case is that the attempts have to be made carefully, that the methods chosen matter as much as the intentions behind them, and that loud confidence is not the same thing as effectiveness. The people most certain they are doing the right thing are often the most dangerous, regardless of which side of any given conversation they are on. The third piece of the argument is that the children of the show, again and again, are presented as the people the writers trust to look at any given situation honestly. Children, in the world of the show, have not yet learned how to look away. They have not yet developed the practiced indifference of the adults around them. They have not yet learned which inheritances are too valuable to question. They look at the flag and they see a flag. They look at the new family and they see a new family. They look at the new student and they see a new student. By returning to this contrast across every season, the show argues that the work of seeing honestly is the most adult work there is, and that most adults have failed at it for reasons the children have not yet learned to share. The work of growing up, in the show's reading, is largely the work of not losing the clarity you started with. That argument is one I find genuinely moving when I sit back from the show and look at it across the whole catalog. The show is loud. The show is offensive. The show is full of material that would not survive a careful reading on its own. But the architecture underneath the loudness is, in places, quite tender. The children are not heroes. They are just children. They are confused. They are mean. They are unfair. They are sometimes wrong. But they are still, in the show's reading, the ones who have not yet built the elaborate machinery the adults have built for looking away. They still see what is in front of them, and the show, episode after episode, returns to them as the source of whatever moral clarity the episode arrives at. The other thing the show has done, very consistently, is refuse to let any single tribe in the conversation feel safe. The show is rude about everyone. It is rude about the loud bigots and rude about the loud anti-bigots. It is rude about the rural conservatives and rude about the urban liberals. It is rude about every religion and rude about every political party. By being equally rude in every direction, the show argues that the work of moral seriousness is not a tribal allegiance. It is a private discipline that anyone can practice and that anyone can abandon. No group is safe from the obligation, and no group can buy its way out of the obligation by belonging to the correct demographic. The argument is uncomfortable. It is meant to be. The show has been refining the discomfort for nearly 30 years, and the discomfort is what makes the show, in its best moments, something more than a comedy. I will be honest with you. There are episodes in this video that I do not think hold up. There are jokes the show has made about race that I would not defend in the way the show defends them. There are visual choices the show has made that would not be made today by any of the writers who made them. The show has, across its run, been willing to say things that it has, in later years, walked back. And the walking back has been quiet rather than loud. That is part of the texture of any long-running piece of art. The artist changes, the audience changes, the world changes. The work that was made 25 years ago does not always survive a viewing today, and the work that is made today will not always survive a viewing 25 years from now. The show has been honest enough in its later years to acknowledge this. The retcon of Tolkien's name is one example. The careful editing of Chef's final story is not. Both are pieces of the same uneven attempt by the show to keep being something it can still defend. What I find ultimately remarkable about South Park, after thinking about it as long as I have for this video, is that the show is still here. It is still running. It is still making episodes. It is still trying to figure out, in front of an audience of millions, what it thinks about the country it lives in. That is the kind of attempt that almost no comedy gets to make for this long. Most shows ossify. Most shows arrive at a position they then defend forever. South Park has not, in my reading, arrived at a position. It has stayed inside the question, and the question is the show. If you have stayed with me this far, into the early hours, into the slow space where these videos are meant to find you, I want to leave you with one last thought before the lights go all the way down. The episodes we have spent tonight walking through are not, on their own, what the show is. They are pieces of a much longer attempt at something that is harder to summarize than any single half hour can carry. The attempt is to make a comedy that does not flinch from the parts of the country it is set in that the country would rather not look at. The attempt is to be funny about things that are not funny, in the hope that the funniness will earn the right to be honest about them. The attempt is to take subjects that other comedies treat with great care and to treat them, instead, with the kind of blunt, exhausted, lived-in honesty that you might hear at a kitchen table at 3 in the morning. Sometimes the attempt works. Sometimes the attempt fails. The show, to its credit, has kept attempting it for almost 30 years. I think, when the show has worked, it has worked because the writers have been willing to look at things most other writers prefer not to look at, and because they have been willing to keep looking even when the looking has made the audience and the network and themselves uncomfortable. I think, when the show has failed, it has failed, because the discomfort can sometimes be its own reward, and the looking can sometimes stop being a moral act and start being a competitive one. The line between the two modes is thin, and the show has crossed it in both directions across the years. The audience watching the show today is, in some sense, the audience the show has been trying to build for the entirety of its run. The audience that can tell the difference between the two modes. The audience that can recognize when the looking is serving the conversation and when it is replacing it. That is a hard audience to be, and the show, in its best moments, has trusted us to be it. South Park is, in the end, a show about a town that is too small to ignore its own problems and too American to ever solve them. The boys grow up. The adults stay where they are. The town keeps producing the same arguments year after year, with slightly different masks on. The show treats the recurrence as a feature, not a bug. The recurrence suggests that the country itself has been having the same arguments for much longer than the show has been around, and that the show, by depicting them in a town nobody would notice on a map, is asking the country to see them more clearly. Whether the country has seen them more clearly is something I cannot answer for you tonight. I can only tell you that the show, episode after episode, has been willing to put them on the screen, and that the willingness, however imperfect, is something I find worth thinking about. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.